Sorry about that.
I had to do the same thing this morning. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the final presentations for the Summer Research Program 2020. Oh, here comes Nadia. In and out. Hang on, let's make sure she gets in. Good morning, Nadia. Okay, welcome to the presentations. We are, I'm looking at Kyle's project. Obviously, I'm Dr. Kurgier. I'm the director of the Summer Research Program. And before we start, I want to give a few thanks to people and give a little guideline for how we're going to be running this today. First of all, for the faculty, Louisa put in the chat box a link to an Airtable survey that we would like you to fill out for each of the presentations. So there are a couple presentations that have 2 or 4 students. So do it per presentation, please. If you have specific notes that you want to write to the individual students, feel free to do that. But basically, we need feedback for each of the presentations so that we can compile all the results and give awards for best presentations. So first off, I want to thank Louisa and Aaron. This is my first year as the Summer Research Program Director, as you all know, and it has been a challenge. And without Louisa and Aaron to keep me sane, keep me organized, tell me what had happened in the past, this whole thing would not have happened. So at some point when you come back to campus, please swing by and let Aaron and Louisa know how much you appreciate everything that they've done, because they really made so many of the details happen. I don't think she's on here, but I also want to thank Dr. Ramore, 1, for giving a presentation, and 2, for leaving me such detailed and wonderful directions on how to run this program. And 3rd, I want to thank Dr. Sheldon, because as I've mentioned in the past, without him starting this whole program, none of us would be here. And he is an amazing director of the Center for Student Research. He gets funding, he keeps everything running. And so just thank you to all of those people who have made this actually work. I'd also like to thank all the faculty, because you guys pivoted really well. We all thought we were going to be in person, and nope, didn't happen. So the faculty who have participated in this, I really appreciate everything you guys have done for your students, because it could have been canceled. And I had a discussion with the students the other day about what had gone right, what had gone wrong, and I sent the faculty sort of a summary of the comments, but 100% of them said it was good to have done it and not canceled it. And just a reminder that we are one of the few schools that kept the Summer Research Program, and so I'm glad that we were able to all put in the extra effort that it took. And finally, students, I bow down to you. You have done an amazing job, all of you. I know you're super nervous about this presentation, and you shouldn't be. As we have told you repeatedly, you know your stuff. You've all done great work. You've all furthered yourself. You've helped us, your faculty. You did great in your practice presentations the other day, and I have 100% faith in all of you that you're going to do wonderfully today. Just remember to breathe, and remember that we are all here to support you. We are not here to criticize you or judge you. We are excited to hear what you have learned, where you want to take your projects, what worked, what didn't work, whatever you want to share with us. This is your chance to just share with us. Pretend it's a coffee chat. Yes, you've all done these beautiful PowerPoints, and yes, it is a formal presentation, and you're all dressed up, and thank you all for doing that. I appreciate that you've all gotten very professional. But again, remember, we're all here to support you. We're all behind you. We all care about you, and we're all super proud of you. So any comments or questions from Louisa or Aaron of anything? Louisa, did you need to give people directions on the Airtable stuff? I don't even know where Louisa is.
No, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's just a survey.
Okay. So what I'm going to be doing is I have all of the students' PowerPoints, except for the students who worked with Dr. Schenk, because they're going to run their own, which may be a little bit of a shift. Again, I'm not super familiar with Zoom, so We're doing this because the video recording is much better than Google. We can see everybody at the same time. And as Dr. Schenk, Dr. Bliss, Dr. Lindemann at the beginning said, can't we please use Zoom? And yes, in the future, we will use Zoom because it just seems to work better. So I'm going to do the best that I can with flipping back and forth with the screens. I've got them all queued up. And so please be kind if I misplace something or it takes me a minute to go between presentations. But we're going to start, just so to remind the students and so the faculty know also, the order is Kyle is going to go first, then Sabrina, then Alicia, then Jody and Renee, then Zoe, then Bryce and Nadia, then Dagim, Jackson, Jacob, and Nick, then Nicole, and Hannah, and we're going to finish with Josh. So if everybody could mute, Dr. Sheldon, your mic is on.
Only because I just tried to get on the computer and you haven't let me in yet.
I have not let you in.
I apologize.
That's okay. So we have several more people coming in. So hang on just a second. Dr. Schimler's joining, a few other people. Dr. Sheldon is now in again. So, all right, Kyle, you're going to be up first. So hopefully this will.
I think that Blair had a question.
Okay, thank you.
Box.
I'm trying to navigate all this stuff, so please interrupt me if I don't see something in the chat box.
Louisa answered it in the chat.
Okay, hang on. Okay, excellent. Thank you. Anybody else have any questions? I will pay attention to the right side of my screen for a second.
Yeah, I put mine in. Did you allow other participants to share their screen? You just have to click on the security tab that's at the bottom. And then it'll say like share screen, allow other participants to share screen.
I am doing that. Allow participants. Got it.
All right, cool.
Okay, so you guys are going number 7. Okay, so I will tell you. So Kyle is going first, and then the way we're going to work this is the students have 7 to 12 minutes to present, and then we're going to have 3 to 5 minutes for questions. Questions can either be raising your hand, putting it in the chat box, unmuting yourself and asking. All of the students have done a PowerPoint, so I'll be running that. So students, you need to tell me when you need me to forward it. So if you just say next slide, that is going to be how we do it. Okay. So here we go with Kyle. And I'm going to mute myself, Kyle. Can you all see that?
Yeah, I can see it. Okay, so I'll go ahead and start then. So, hello, my name is Kyle May. My advisor is Dr. Crystal Howell, and our research project was funded by the Randolph College Summer Research Program. Our research is titled Resources, Riches in Rural America, a visual study of school buildings and their surroundings in communities dominated by extractive industries. Next slide, please. Now, before we delve into all aspects of the project, I want us to each take a second and evaluate these 2 school entrances. Now, did you think of one differently from the other? What does the physical structure tell you about the community? And what if I told you that the school on the right is located in a wealthier neighborhood than the one on the left? Does that change your opinion about the school? Does it not? Well, by answering these questions, you have all just taken part of a simple visual analysis. This is at the core of our project and will be the subject matter of much of my presentation. Next slide, please. And before we delve into all of the aspects of visual analysis, we're going to start with the project purpose. The goal of our project was 3-pronged. First, we wanted to determine how schools reflect their communities, social and economic structures. We plan to do this by using historical and contemporary images with tax revenue and school funding information to analyze communities and their changes over time. Lastly, we are going to share our findings with scholars and members of the community alike in the form of an exhibit. Next slide, please. Specifically, we asked the research questions: how are schools funded in the target communities? And what is the relationship between federal, state, and local revenues as they relate to school funding? How have economic shifts related to resource extraction affected schools and the selected communities? And how do schools reflect their communities' economies in tangible and symbolic ways? Next slide, please. And starting with methodology, we'll start off with site selection. So along with answering the 3 research questions, we also evaluated our communities based on evidence of a history in resource extraction. We looked for communities that had an array of historical records that were easily accessible, and this goes hand in hand with evidence of a historical society or community organization. We looked for communities with such organizations because they proved to be a great source of information and provided a location for an exhibit. After some deliberation, we decided on the target communities of Buchanan, West Virginia, Richlands, Virginia, and Wilkesboro, North Carolina. Next slide, please. Continuing with methodology, community analysis, and our first step in community analysis is gathering quantitative data. This includes information like population data, household income, property tax records, and average house values in each community. It also includes compiling information on school funding, which is different at the state level. The second step is collecting visual data and using thematic analysis to evaluate this data. Now, this is at the heart of our project. We are utilizing an arts-based educational research approach, otherwise known as ABER, which focuses on using qualitative data to define the research matter. This was originally defined by Brown and Eisner with regard to written work. However, ABER applies to visual research as well, which is why it is the basis of our project. Lastly, we will gather other visual data to fill in the history of communities and schools. This includes things such as historical images of schools and the surrounding community. Next slide, please. Now we're going to go on to state funding schemes. And so state schools funding come through multiple avenues, but in each state, there's always a local component to their schemes. This usually comes in the form of property taxes, and each state goes about this local funding differently. Virginia sets a minimum standard required to operate free public schools known as the Standards of Quality, or SOQ. It uses a composite index to award more state funding to school divisions with lower property and sales tax revenues. Its goal is to create a system that is equitable. However, the SOQ value is still below the true operational costs, and only a certain percentage of property taxes from each county can be taken. West Virginia defines property into 4 categories: farming products and equipment, residential property, property outside of the municipality, and property inside the municipality that is different from the first 2 categories. In West Virginia, the required local share for what is known as the foundation program varies based on population density. Therefore, counties that are more rural use a smaller proportion of their revenue, and so the state contributes slightly more in these areas. This is another attempt at creating a more equitable system, but West Virginia uses population density as a proxy for affluence instead of evaluating affluence directly. Lastly, West Virginia only requires that property taxes are based on a 60% of true property values. Virginia uses 100% assessment for property taxes. Now, North Carolina is a bit different in that it separates school funding into 2 categories: current expenses, which is school operations, such as teacher salaries, and capital needs, which is maintaining public school facilities. While it is the responsibility of the county for capital funding, the state has some involvement of about 8%. However, counties have continued to contribute larger amounts to current expenses in recent years. As of 2015, counties contribute close to 1/4 of all current expenses, or roughly $3 billion a year. This state also leaves assessment of property taxes up to the county, which are reevaluated every 5 to 8 years. As of 2019, Wilkes County property taxes were based on a 67% assessment of true property values. The difference in state funding schemes is evident in their national education ratings. According to U.S. News, Virginia ranks 8th in the nation for pre-college education, while West Virginia ranks 42nd and North Carolina 28th. Next slide, please. This is where you click again, Dr. Courier. So this is visual analysis, and this is where we're getting to, like I was saying before, the heart of our project. And so we identified 6 steps to our visual analysis. First was to take the photos, obviously. Second was to review the photos we took. Third was to identify patterns and develop codes, which are known as variables and values. We created the variables of levels of development, connection to other community organizations and activities, barriers, apparent maintenance of school buildings and grounds, apparent affluence of surrounding community, and outdoor recreation spaces. We also created the values of low, medium, or high for each variable. Step 4 was to go through individually and evaluate each school for each variable. And in step 5, we compared our results and worked toward a consensus on each school's value. Lastly, in step 6, we discussed any emerging patterns deemed miscellaneous, such as plaques honoring donors. So an example of such a visual analysis would be outdoor recreation spaces. This is the variable, and our values are low, medium, and high. By further defining each value in the context of the variable, we can get an idea of how well a school fits into each category. Next slide, please. And so during our discussion of variables, we identified 3 that were more important. The first is barriers. Barriers signify a school's role in the community. The more intense the barrier, the less of a role the school plays in their community. This carries over to community access to equipment. If there are greater barriers to equipment, the less likely it is that the community will be able to use them. Lastly, barriers also signify the perceived safety of students. If there are greater barriers, it is safe to assume that the students are perceived as less safe in their environment. An example of low barriers is Moravian Falls Elementary. There are no barriers to any equipment aside from signage. This is also the school that has an elk farm behind it that I mentioned last time. So they clearly perceive their students as safe. Academy Elementary School is an example of a medium barrier school because there is some fencing, but the facilities are not locked and the fencing is more for keeping young children in than keeping others out. Lastly, Wilkesboro is an example of high barriers because any equipment not part of the community park is heavily fenced and tightly locked. This shows that they are concerned about keeping people out along with keeping young children in. Next slide, please. So now the second most important one was community connection, which you can also think of as community outreach and also displays the school's role in the local community. This is demonstrated by items like signage for special events, holding 4-H camps, meeting places for Boy Scout troops, or being a site for online connection. There are also other uses for schools such as night school, vocational school, and voting sites that demonstrate how they further are connected to their communities. Lastly, schools serve as a source of information to the community. They provide updates for things like the census, voting registration, and local community events. When evaluating schools, we actually found no schools that were low in community connection, further demonstrating their involvement. Richlands Middle School was an example of a medium community connection as it had some signage for programs such as the Project Discovery flyer pictured here, but it did not appear to have a lot of programs held on the physical premises. Lastly, Buchanan Upshur High School serves as an example of high community connection because it had flyers and signage like Richlands, but it also serves the community with vocational classes pictured in this photo here. Next slide, please. And then the third of the most important variables that we found was apparent affluence. And this is a little more self-explanatory. We evaluated this variable by identifying the lot size, apparent maintenance required, and the estimated average home values of the 15 closest houses to the school. Low apparent affluence, such as Richland Middle School, had houses with small lot sizes, clear maintenance required, and estimated average home values less than $100,000. Medium apparent affluence, such as Tennerton Elementary School had houses with larger lots, less required maintenance, and estimated average home values between $100,000 and $150,000. And if you can see where this is going, lastly, high apparent affluence, such as Wilkesboro Elementary School, had houses with the largest lots, the least required maintenance, and the highest estimated average home values at or above $150,000. Next slide, please. So what? Why is this important? So schools are an integral part of the community. They serve as sources of information, voting sites, online access, youth camps, and much more. Schools also provide an outlet for recreation. Under normal circumstances, playgrounds, blacktops, and athletic facilities are open to the local community. Old schools such as Lincoln Heights and Old North Wilkesboro are used as arts and recreation centers. Also, many community parks and recreation facilities are connected to school grounds. Examples include community parks at Buchanan Upshur High School and Wilkesboro Elementary School. The third takeaway is that community wealth directly impacts the school's funding. This has significant implications for a school's ability to provide quality education to their students and provide the above mission services in their community. Lastly, our visual analysis asks the question, should school funding schemes be reevaluated? As the current dependency on local property taxes and state funding schemes has created discrepancies in educational opportunity, not only in the county level, but within the county as well. Next slide, please. So COVID-19 complications. Due to COVID-19, our camera was put on back order and did not arrive until late June. This carried over into visual analysis as we suspect that the variable barriers and apparent upkeep of buildings and grounds were affected by COVID-19. We hypothesized that there were greater barriers due to potential health risks associated with social contact and that schools were in worse condition due to longer periods of neglect. There were also issues in communication. Local resources such as historical societies and register of deeds rely heavily on face-to-face communication. This made attaining historical records and images difficult. Next slide, please. So our next steps in the project are creating an exhibit and writing a research article. We originally consulted Dr. Jean Graves about photo labeling for our exhibit. Dr. Graves has been a museum education professional for over 20 years and recently earned her PhD in curriculum and instruction. Our conversation quickly turned into a discussion about how to present the exhibit. She challenged us to rethink our exhibit in ways to promote community feedback and incorporate participatory research, which is using the community feedback in future research. Lastly, we are also keeping an eye out for potential education conferences, virtual or otherwise, where we can present our research. Next slide, please. And that's it. Thank you for listening to my presentation.
Can I just tell you, Kyle, you did 11 minutes and 59 seconds.
Yeah, I knew I was gonna be cutting it close on the time.
Awesome. I know that Jean Graves is actually on this call. So who has questions for Kyle? First off, that was amazing. And this could be history or sociology as well.
And education.
And education, and yeah.
Geography as well.
Economics too.
Yeah, and economics. I see Liz's.
And psychology. I mean, this is what's great about a lot of these projects. They could go in many of the disciplines. Okay, Hannah, you have a question.
Yeah, so it kind of piqued my interest when you were discussing, potential complications due to COVID. And I know that you had said that, there's a lack of communication in terms of getting historical documents. So in terms of that, my question is, were some schools very reserved to share those historical documents, or were for the most part they willingly wanted to share them, or what was your experience with that?
So my experience, I focused on Wilkesboro, in the Wilkesboro area, and the Wilkes Heritage Museum, which is basically the historical society there, was very open and happy to share their photos with me. However, I do know that Dr. Howell, who focused on Buchanan and Richland, had an issue with getting in contact with these societies and these organizations. So I think all of them were open to sharing information because I think all of them want their community to be, kind of known. However, I think a lot of them, just because they had a hard time communicating virtually in a way, were not willing to share in that way. That makes sense.
Thank you.
Kyle, I have a question about school funding. Did you look at, with buildings, sometimes states have literary money that would help with buildings. Did you look at what percentage, or were you able to get to that information saying of what percentage of buildings were supported by the state funding?
If you mean by buildings, you're talking about, or like state funding, you're talking about any kind of state funding, or are you talking about a specific type of state funding?
Now, if you were able to find out whether the buildings, were the newer buildings, were they, like in Virginia, it's called literary money, and whether there was any of that information to say, well, that particular building was built with that type of money, or it was from the county or city directly. That's all.
Oh, okay. No, I was not able to find that exact information. I do know some lottery information, though, and that the lottery was used in all 3 states for specifically for school building and school funding, or like capital investment. However, I know in North Carolina, they have cut that to just a $100 million lump sum, which originally they were only doing 40% to education, which was still about 160 million, 180 million. So they've cut that even further to just 100 million.
So Dr. Schenk has a question, but that needs to be the last question so that we stay somewhat on time schedule. So Dr. Schenk?
Yeah, so I'm wondering about this criteria when you were looking at fenced in and as a proxy for participating in community or, openness. I'm just thinking of, Lincoln Elementary, where they have a big fence over the whole playground, but you can see the kids are like leaning against that fence and there's cars coming right next, that's obviously for the safety of the kids, a lot less than there would be for, at least that would be my interpretation. But I don't know if you'd know that unless you saw the kids there, like leaning against the fence right next to cars rushing by. I don't know. So you know what I'm saying? Like that seems like a hard conclusion to make just from sort of looking at the fences or something.
I see what you're saying with that, but part of the barriers values that we're looking at was if it was locked. So like Lincoln Middle School, elementary school, you can get to the playgrounds without going through any type of locks and stuff like that. And actually, we know this because we tested out our photography skills at Lincoln Elementary and Middle School at one point. And so that was what made it really if it was a high barrier, it was that it was locked. So when you go to Wilkesboro Elementary School, there was a 6-foot fence that surrounded the entire playground. And it had even like little spikes on the top of the fencing. And there was some pretty heavy duty bolts or locks that were pretty rusted, showing they'd been there for a while. So that's why we decided that was a high barrier. And that's what we were looking for. Yes, Jody, that is definitely a good point. It really does say a lot about I can't say words right now, but demographic of the area.
Mm-hmm. So thank you so much, Kyle. You did a fabulous job. So we're going to move on to Sabrina. And Sabrina, you ready? I am going to try and share my
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Move my hair from my mic.
Can you see the screen?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm going to mute myself.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Sabrina Johnson, and I'm a rising senior at Randolph College, majoring in elementary education. I had the opportunity this summer to work virtually with Dr. Cheryl Lindeman, who is the assistant professor in the education department. For our summer research project, we examined how do elementary mathematics and science teachers acquire strategies and content knowledge to promote student success. Next slide, please. Okay, so I will begin by giving a brief overview of how we went about approaching the project, and then move on to the demographics of our participants, and then direct you through the 5 sub-research questions that guided our qualitative analysis. Next slide, please. So why is our research important? Well, since there is no more federal funding for math and science partnerships, teachers are forced to make their own decisions on what professional developments they attend. We had the opportunity to invite elementary mathematics and science teachers to share their professional experience in an informational virtual environment this summer. And on a personal level, this study will be extremely valuable to me as I continue my teaching career. In education programs, pre-service teaching refers to a period of guided and supervised teaching in the classroom. What makes our study unique is that we had the opportunity to not only read, but also listen to how teachers self-reflect and develop their personal learning pathways. So now you may be wondering, what in the world are learning pathways? Next slide, please. So I'm give you a couple of our working definitions just to clarify our educational jargon. We based our research on the concept of deeper learning, as Linda Darling Hammond and Oakes defined in their recent book as experiences equipping students with the skills to find, analyze, and apply knowledge in new and emerging contexts and situations, and prepare them for college, work, and civil participation in lifelong learning in a fast-changing and informational-rich world. So deeper learning involves students and teachers working together towards a common goal. So hold that thought and we'll come back to that. And then moving on to learning pathways. A learning pathway is the route or choices that teachers make on their own to strengthen their capacity for teaching and learning. Dr. Lemon and I have been referring to these pathways as stepping stones. Teachers are focused on learning pathways for their students, but in our research, we focused on capturing the teachers' reflections about their own personal learning pathways. In the education profession, we refer to this process as professional development, or PD. Next slide, please. So we identified 5 sub-questions that guided our 8 weeks of research. Within the 5 sub-questions, we had 5 themes, which were teaching philosophy, professional development, COVID-19 teaching changes, learning pathways, and pre-service teachers. Next slide, please. And here are the last 2 sub-questions that we used. And as a pre-service teacher myself, learning about veteran teachers' pathways and advice they have for pre-service teachers will not only be valuable to me, but also aid new teachers in the field. Next slide, please. Our modes of inquiry involved qualitative methods. First, we developed a survey, then conducted the virtual chats using Zoom, and finally analyzed and coded the plethora of data that we collected. And when I say plethora, I really do mean a huge plethora of data that we had collected. Next slide, please. Okay, so how do we begin developing our survey? We analyzed survey questions from the 2018 National Survey of Science and Mathematics Education and modified them for our survey. Permission was granted on the report to use and modify their questions as long as we cite them appropriately. We then sent our draft of our 11 survey questions and 6 virtual chat questions to our selected panel of external experts prior to requesting Randolph's IRB board approval. Once our IRB was approved, we developed our Google form, which is a type of surveying program. We created a letter of invitation to participate that was then distributed by email, and I will talk more about who we sent that email to later in the presentation. Next slide, please. So what was the difference between the survey questions and the virtual chat questions? Well, this graphic gives you the idea that while the virtual chat questions have a correlation to the survey questions, they had to be more engaging to elicit the meaningful conversations. Having done these virtual chats, I've realized that teachers are more willing to talk in a comfortable environment, and that these chats provided that for them. Next slide, please. And after evaluating all the transcripts from the virtual chats, we were able to get more detailed answers than just what the survey had provided. We're also able to ask the teacher follow-up questions about their responses during the virtual chats, not only for the responses they gave in the virtual chats, but also follow-up questions to what they had put in their survey answers. Next slide, please. As you can see in the graphic, we had 71 teachers respond to our survey over a period of 3 weeks, which is a great response rate. We're really super excited about that. And at the end of the survey, there was an option to sign up for our virtual chats. Our virtual chats invites were managed through Zoom, and we had anywhere from 1 to 4 teachers in each chat. During the chat, we had the set of those 6 questions, and those 6 questions allowed for more open discussion than the questions on the survey. We chatted with 15 of the 71 teachers, which gave us 21% of our total responses, which allowed us to hit our goal of 20%. Through these, we were able to speak to many wonderful teachers where they shared their advice and self-efficacy. And on another personal level, this opportunity was a lot more than what I would have been able to get in just a normal practicum assignment. Next slide, please. So we developed a plan to invite elementary teachers to participate in the survey by relying on teachers who had previously participated in Randolph College Chev Institutes, Randolph College Education alums, Randolph College Friends and Mentors, and the Randolph College Education Advisory Committee contacts, who then extended our invitation to their teachers. Next slide, please. So what is the profile of teachers' teaching experiences in the last 3 years? As you can see here, we focused our attention on the subjects the teachers taught with mathematics and science noted. We also asked them to indicate whether they taught in a private or public school. Next slide, please. Thanks to Dr. Lindeman, we were able to use Atlas TI, which is a coding program, to code our data this summer. We established 3 code groups, which were SRP, the Summer Research Program, Deeper Learning, and the NTAS standards. For the purpose of this presentation, we looked at the analysis of the surveys and the virtual chat questions for our SRP descriptions based on reading the transcripts and the components of the deeper learning definition. Further analysis will include the third coding group, which are referenced to the National Teaching Standards. Next slide, please. Okay, so for our first sub-question, curiosity research by Markey and Weinstein challenges researchers to look for connections with the teacher's curiosity and their teaching perspectives. So that's why we include the question for the teachers, which was, to what extent is curiosity integrated into their teaching philosophies when promoting deeper learning and student success? We chose to begin our survey with this question to elicit teachers' sense of their own curiosity and if there is a relationship with their professional development preferences. Teachers were asked to select which statements or sentences applied to their teaching philosophy. The 4 statements are based on Kashian et al. 2009's curiosity trait research. So as you can see on the screen, A and C were stretching, which means to seek new information and experiences, while A and B were embracing novel experiences of everyday life. The higher percentage of participants indicating stretching traits were not surprising since that's what teachers normally do, versus the embracing traits that had a lower percentage might indicate teachers who concentrate on their own classroom. We plan to dive more into this data to understand other relationships of this question to the professional development responses. Next slide, please. Our second sub-question focused on how teachers express their professional development experiences pertaining to deeper learning. So going back to Linda Darling Hammond's definition of deeper learning, you can see that these teachers what these teachers are expressing relates directly back to deeper learning. They want their students to be equipped with the skills needed to apply knowledge and progress them to be lifelong learners. Next slide, please. Moving on to the third sub-question that we have, which is COVID. We use this virtual opportunity to our advantage and included this question about the COVID-19 online learning challenges. Many teachers believe that they should attend more professional developments that are centered around the use of technology, flipped classrooms, and the different approaches to hands-on learning, since hands-on science instruction will most likely suffer. Teachers express their concerns about how much remediation will be needed because they anticipate students will have gaps in their learning progress when they return to school in the fall. Next slide, please. For the purpose of this study, my challenge was identifying stepping stones and guideposts by translating what teachers shared on the survey and virtual chats. I clustered the stepping stones by differentiating the identifiable goals, processes, and outcomes. Next slide, please. So this is me in my mind. It's what I imagined as I worked through the comments and the codes and the stepping stones. And then I thought, what about the learning pathways? Like, what are they going to look like? Are they stepping stones? Are they guideposts? How do the teachers describe their processes? Next slide, please. So here is what I synthesized for work today. It is clear that the professional development was chosen to help their teaching, but their ultimate goal was to see students' excitement and enthusiasm, which were paramount to the test scores. Teachers wanted tangible strategies that they can bring back to the classroom and immediately use to have the students engaged and excited about learning new material. And from these are two separate learning pathways that I came up with, and I think when Dr. Lindeman and I dive deeper into the research, we'll be able to see a couple more pathways. Next slide, please. So our final sub-question directly related to my interest of becoming a teacher. During my chats with the veteran teachers, they gave me a multitude of advice. Of the advice given, the four main points were repeatedly reiterated. So 1, be a lifelong learner. 2, seek out as many opportunities as possible during your first years of teaching. 3, find a positive and strong mentor to guide you. And 4, reach out and find professional development that speaks to your curiosity and what is within your content area. Next slide, please. So reiterating our original question and linking the data back to student success, here's our learning stepping stones added up. Next slide, please. And to summarize our findings today with 3 key areas. Teachers are empowered to continually improve their teaching. They express self-efficacy to take their personal lead in learning content. Teachers expressed that teaching during COVID-19 will present challenges. There will be an urgency to learn more technology skills to help students and their parents. The advice I heard for pre-service teachers reinforced my understanding about veteran teachers' concerns and solutions for improving their daily practices. And then what am I going to be doing next with this research? Where is it going to go? I am excited that I've had this opportunity to begin my senior paper and continue this research. Dr. Lindeman and I intend to present and publish the findings of this study. We will actually be presenting live at the VAST conference, the VAST virtual conference in November. Next slide, please. And so the research process will continue for us. After collecting and analyzing this study's data, Dr. Lindeman and I have realized that the story is far from over because teachers are always continually learning, and education in general is always changing. So we intend to continue the analysis of the data. Next slide, please. And here are a few references. Next slide. And thank you for listening.
Okay, Josh got in first. What's your question, Josh?
Yeah, so my question came very early on that I took notes about. I was wondering when federal funding for the math and science partnerships was stopped. Was this an action of the Trump administration with Betsy DeVos, or was it earlier on?
And I'm going to be honest with you, I'm not quite sure. I'd have to go back and read in the literature, but I do know that the past few years, there has been absolutely no funding, and that's why teachers are struggling. It's not the right word, but they have been struggling to find professional developments that is in tune to what their school or district allow them to attend and also is in their content area. So I can always get back to you with that answer. I can find that for you.
It was the Trump administration, and I believe it was 2017.
Thank you. Thank you.
Dr. Gross?
Yeah, I just had two quick questions. First of all, you did great.
Thank you.
But with the curiosity traits, so the very first question they answered on the surveys, were they allowed to endorse more than one? So it was sort of which of these apply to me?
Yeah, so we had between the 4 questions, and they could select as many as they wanted between the 4 statements. But going through the data and separating them between a mix between the embracing and the stretching, or if they were solely doing the embracing or the stretching, and that's how we calculated that data.
My other question was, I noticed, and I think it was either on the learning pathways or professional development slide, is that you had a little bullet point about rabbit trails, and so I was just curious about what a rabbit trail was.
So we came up with terms for the learning pathways, and we used the word rabbit trails because that's what one of the veteran teachers that we interviewed referred to it as. So we thought that was quite interesting. So I guess the best way to describe that would be, that's another way you could describe the learning pathway is the rabbit trail, but you don't want to go too far off on your rabbit trail because you want to end up at your main goal that you had set.
Makes sense, thanks.
Thank you.
Any other questions? That was fantastic, Sabrina. Thank you. Okay, Alicia, anybody have any comments or questions before we move on to the next one? Okay, so share screen. And there we go. All right, I'm muting myself.
Okay, 1 second. Can you guys hear me? Should I get closer? Can you guys hear me now? All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Alicia Garcia Cruz. I worked with Dr. Courier this summer, and today I'll be presenting our research project on the discussion of violence within the Latinx families. Next slide. Before we go any further, I wanted to provide some sociological definitions for everyone, starting with Hispanic and Latino, Latina, and Latinx. At the moment, the representation of this population within the U.S. Census Bureau only counts as people who self-identify as Hispanic, and this is resulting in people having difficulties when it comes to less generalized representation of a population to research. This is a common term used in the U.S., and the term doesn't represent all Latinx because they speak other languages besides Spanish, such as Portuguese, French, and indigenous languages, and more. So I decided to revolve my research surrounding the term Latinx because I believe it to be the most inclusive for everybody who is of Latin descent. And this term is predominantly used on social media and recently in higher education. Next slide. Interpersonal violence, or IPV, and domestic violence, which I'm going to be acknowledging as DV. Although women are more likely to be targeted, anyone can be a victim of both interpersonal violence or domestic violence, and these are usually similar, except for predominantly the biggest difference between them is that domestic violence takes place within a family unit. And so, next slide. So a big one that we have in our project is the term machismo and Marianmisa. And machismo has both positive and negative aspects of masculinity, including bravery, honor, dominance, aggression, sexism, and reserved emotions. Some beliefs consider that it's appropriate for women to remain in traditional roles, thus encouraging male dominance over women. And then the term Marianmisa, it idolizes these ideals, these traditions of feminine gender roles that are often characterized as being submissive, selflessness, and chastity, and hyperfemininity, as well as accepting the machismo within males. Next slide. Another term I would be using is the term patriarchy, and this is important because it correlates with the machismo socialization by reinforcing the narrative that men hold power and women hold less power. And I believe that those are very important to connect, and when considering two cultures clashing in this melting pot of a country. And another term is generational transmission of knowledge. And with this term, often people don't realize that what they've learned from their parents or grandparents or their family members could be sometimes unhealthy or problematic because it's all they know. And usually it doesn't have to be all bad. It's just how the beliefs and attitudes and behaviors are passed from one generation to the next. And next slide. So now that we got the terminology out of the way, so why is this research important? Our research examined the cultural basis of the silence and the stigma surrounding these topics such as IPV and DV. I want to specify that what this knowledge is and how it's shared between multiple generations again, through the generational transference of knowledge. So I wanted to see what our community is sharing or what they aren't. The family is a social institution, and it's one of the most important socializing agents in our culture, and examining how the patterns of violence are happening and how they aren't being discussed or how they are being discussed is important to help develop social policies and changing the generational transmission of knowledge to end said violence. Interpersonal violence also needs to be taken very seriously, as it's a result of not only a lifelong physical or psychological health issues for the victims, but it can also generate into social and economic risks for society as a whole. Next slide. So if you look at this graph, it displays the population increase of the Hispanic population over the past recent decades, resulting in 2019 reaching a staggering 60.6 million people. And already research suggests that 1 in 3 Latina women will or have experienced IPV resulting in the Hispanic population already having a large part of them dealing with these traumatic experiences. By the year 2050, it's predicted to be that the Hispanic population will be 30% of the US population altogether. This is roughly 132.8 million people. And according to the Census Bureau, that's the statistics they provided just for Hispanics. We don't know the full story since it's not including Latinos as a whole. And this leaves a large population in the US at risk of experiencing IPV and DV. Next slide. So in our research, we did a meta-academic analysis, and something that was repeatedly mentioned is that there's a lack of academic literature when in comparison to other demographics surrounding this community, and more so the lack of representation of this amazing diversity within it. So the one commonality that is widely used to represent the Latinx community is languages. But of course, Spanish and Portuguese are the two main ones, but they're often put up into a broad category, this population, and it ultimately erases their differences. And the current research surrounding domestic violence and interpersonal violence doesn't always reflect that the diversity of the population, which could result in dangerous consequences as the needs of the community aren't being fully explored based on the generalization of the research. With our research, hopefully, we hope to try to accomplish representation because it is really important, I believe, especially when reading up on it. Next slide. So we also looked up public resources that are available specifically online since it was easiest access. And we looked at this on the state level, national level, international level. We found that there was a lot of definitions, terms, and resources to connect victims to seek help and identify their own situations. In our research, I found that especially comforting because Latinx women have difficulties when it comes to seeking help or even identifying the abuse that they're experiencing. But it was great to see a lot of English accessible information. And another thing I would like to add that Spanish and Portuguese are the major languages spoken by Latin Americans, but some of these resources were not accessible online because there wasn't specification for the Latinx community or Spanish speakers. Next slide. During our research, we did a great, sorry, I keep saying that. We did great at researching on how machismo culture, not culture, machizo socialization teaches men that they have to be dominant, strong, and in control, even though that means being violent against men or with people that they love. In the US, this can be compared to sort of the term toxic masculinity. Both of them manifest from the patriarchal societies and beliefs. And this is something that's very different when in comparison to other communities because it's solely based off of this culture and between Latin America and each other, I guess. Machismo also grants them authority over women, which often perpetuates the use of violence for power and ultimately leads to IPV and domestic violence. Next slide. So Marianmisa is often deemed as women and the ability to withstand extreme sacrifices and suffering at the stake of their family, and where they prioritize the comfort of men rather than themselves. And we find that women set the importance of a child's well-being, thus creating a serious reason for women and why they consider escaping domestic violence and interpersonal violence. But on the other hand, it can also be having the opposite effect, as women might be more inclined to endure these type of experiences to keep the family together as a solid unit. Okay, next slide. So when addressing this, I also wanted to include how the LGBTQ community does play into this. And with Machismo and Marianmisa dynamic, it excludes the more roles of LGBTQ relationships, and even though they exist. And for LGBTQ and in the Latinx community, sexuality is becoming more accepting, but it's still considered as something that doesn't go well with the cultural norms or beliefs. Machismo reserves the emotions, especially for women, and perpetuates emotions in men as being considered gay. And this is reinforcing the homophobic beliefs. I just wanted to include that because I think it's very interesting and important. So next slide. Religion is also a very big factor when considering researching this, and something we obviously found within the research. And the Latin is very huge, and religion is very much a part of it. 62% of Latinos identify as being Catholic, and specifically with this religion, there where things are like divorce, abortion, LGBTQ, promiscuity, and premarital sex are often deemed as sinful. This relates to Machismo and Marianmisa as well, since the values are being reinforced through this religion. When we talk about generational transmission of knowledge, religion is one aspect to especially look at when it comes to the values and beliefs being passed on from generation to generation, such as Catholicism or any other religion in Latin America or the US. Next slide. So next we'll be talking about immigration and how it's, oh, 1 second. Okay, so next we will be talking about immigration, and since 2000, the immigration in this community has been on a steady decline. It was at its peak in 2007 at 55% of Hispanics being foreign-born, but it's since dropped as recent as 2016 to 47.9%. Next slide. This graph shows on how Hispanic and foreign-born domestic are, they compare and how they both contribute to the rising population within the US. I think it's a very visual graphic. On the structural basis of immigration, it's a contributing factor because victims of IPV and DV are more at risk in situations with seclusion, language barriers, and less legal knowledge and accessibility to resources. This results into them being some of the most vulnerable within the Latinx community and at risk of IPV and DV. The situation might be also increased if the person happens to be undocumented. During the research, current academic literature has shown that people fear often being reported to immigration or police, resulting in their deportation and separation from family unit. And this is not just for the perpetrators, but also for the victims who report the crime. And then next slide. So for my, what's the future of this project? So prior to COVID-19, we planned on conducting in-person qualitative interviews, but our plans had to be changed due to the circumstances. And Dr. Courier has done an informative interview and will be submitting an IRB application in the fall of 2020 in order to conduct online interviews. SRP was honestly really good 8 weeks, and we gathered enough academic literature to continue this work for the upcoming 2 years. I will present my completed project for my senior seminar in sociology and possibly even psychology as well. Post SRP, we will continue to create itineraries for participants when conducting the interviews online. But until then, this was a great stepping stone in creating a 2+ year project. And I think others and myself are going to be very excited for seeing the findings in the year 2022.
Okay, who has questions? I see Sarah, Dr. Soika.
Yes. So one of the things this made me think of is a lot of years ago, my older sister, who's a psychologist, did a study on perceptions of date rape correlated with hypermasculinity. And she was actually at Auburn University, very much in the South, in Alabama at that time. And what she actually found, the study scenario was that students the participants read sort of through a scenario and identified when it crossed the line. And what she actually found is that the more hyper-masculine students identified that earlier, which is really contrary to most other things. And she actually thought it was because of this Southern protectiveness of women piece. And I wonder if you would see something somewhat similar, kind of a sort of a two-end perception of domestic violence related to machismo. Does that make sense? Does that feel like something you might see in the Latinx community as well? There's a great protection of women, but then also a sense of women as kind of property or something like that. I don't know if I'm phrasing it quite right, but it was a result that surprised me when she found it, and I thought it might also be relevant to what you're talking about. And I guess I want your perception on, is it relevant?
I honestly think that is relevant. I mean, much like any other community, like men predominantly, when it comes to protection, some women don't perceive it as protection but more as control. And I think that I might possibly see it in this study, but I'm not precisely sure because some research does suggest that, you know, some women don't identify it, especially because it's the norm. But I do know that there is a sense of, like, you know, overbearing probably when it comes to protection. And I don't know, I haven't interviewed anybody yet about it, but that would be a really interesting aspect to actually look at and to see if it compares to other demographics especially.
Thank you.
Other questions? Am I missing any hands? Well, I obviously think this is awesome, fascinating research. So if there are no more questions, we're going to move on to Renee and Jody. You guys ready? And if you are ready, I will share the screen. All right, making sure you can see it.
Hello, my name is Jody Mesidor. And my name is Renee Sarpon. This summer, we worked alongside Dr. Bliss to analyze the independent and combined effects of elevated carbon dioxide and temperature on major agricultural crops, specifically potatoes and tomatoes. Next slide, please. So as we study global atmospheric changes with regard to human activities, it is important to note that the atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration has risen by more than 45% since pre-industrial times, from an equilibrium level of about 280 parts per million in 1880 to the currently observed levels of 407 parts per million. This dramatic increase is a direct result of human activities, primarily things such as fossil fuel burning, cement production, and modified land use patterns. If present emission patterns continue into the future, atmospheric carbon dioxide will be doubled by the end of the 21st century. It is suggested that the projected increase in carbon dioxide will modify the global climate by causing widespread rising of surface temperatures as well as air temperatures. This occurs because of altered precipitation patterns and global hydrologic cycle, which increases the frequency of severe events such as drought spells and flooding. Agricultural crop production is one of the key human factors that may be significantly affected by this, with consequences to global food supply. Ultimately, the net effects of increased carbon dioxide and temperature may be detrimental to agricultural crops. Next slide, please. So tomatoes and potatoes were selected because they are included among main horticultural crops worldwide. Due to their broad availability and nutritional characteristics, they are considered to be two of the most important components of the human diet. Nevertheless, potatoes and tomatoes contain a naturally occurring toxin called solanine, which comprises a great amount of the total glycoalkaloid present in the plant. Solanine is a physiologically active glycoalkaloid of these two plants, along with other species of this genus, such as eggplants, tobacco, peppers, and a lot more other plants. This alkaloid is bitter tasting and has poisonous properties that have caused certain concerns in geographical areas. Symptoms of glycoalkaloid poisoning include colic pain in the abdomen and stomach, vomiting, fever, rapid pulse, low blood pressure, and even neurological disorders. Next slide, please. In this experiment, we increased the level of carbon dioxide and temperature in potatoes and tomatoes to determine what if any detrimental effects occurred. We expected to see an increase in biomass due to increased carbon dioxide, but we also expected that increased temperature might decrease that biomass. We speculated that increased carbon dioxide and temperature in combination might increase toxic solanine levels in both potatoes and tomatoes. By analyzing the biomass, leaf angle, the number of leaves, the height of the plant, and the solanine levels, we will be able to see if the factors set by the experiment, which mimic factors of climate change, have an effect on these agricultural plants. Next slide, please.
We started this experiment by choosing agricultural crops, tomato and potato. We then found the environmental conditions to replicate, elevated CO2 and temperature, between 280 and 407 for ambient CO2 and roughly 1,000 parts per million for elevated CO2. Between 80 degrees plus or minus 5 degrees for ambient temperature and between 95 degrees plus or minus 5 for elevated temperature. We installed 4 chambers in each of our locations. We monitored the plants for 3 weeks, administering CO2 into the chamber via breathing and watering when necessary. At the end of the 3 weeks, we harvested above ground samples for biomass, measured the final measurements, and recorded leaf angles. Next slide, please.
So we used the t-test, which is a statistical analysis used to determine if there's a significant difference between the mean of each treatment group compared with the control group. We started with the measurement of biomass, which is considered a good measurement of plant health because it reflects the amount of sunlight, water, carbon dioxide, and minerals a plant is able to capture and turn into plant mass. The t-test described the trends as not being significantly different. The trends were similar in tomatoes and potatoes, with control groups having the lowest biomass. Elevated carbon dioxide alone, elevated temperature alone, and elevated carbon dioxide and temperature combined all had a higher biomass than the control plants, which had ambient carbon dioxide and ambient temperature. The differences were not significant due to the large differences in plants across our 3 replicants. Next slide, please. A moment, please. We also measured leaf angle, which was shown to be significantly larger in tomato plants with elevated carbon dioxide, even regardless of temperature. Although these morphological characteristics showed no trends other than leaf angle, they were not statistically significant, and the main goal of our study is to analyze the chemical components of these plants to determine if the toxin solanine will show any significant trends, specifically in the plants with elevated carbon dioxide and temperature. Due to the restrictions set by the current global pandemic, we were unable to conduct this portion since it requires access to a laboratory. We have planned to do this bulk of the experiment in the next few weeks in order to add it to our data and finalize our experiment. Next slide, please.
In this project, we examined the combined and independent effects of enhanced levels of carbon dioxide and temperature on plant growth. Increase in carbon dioxide and temperature had a profound effect on 2 of the agricultural plants we studied. In tomatoes, all treatment groups had a higher biomass than the control plants. Therefore, in tomato plants, our data showed a trend towards increased biomass of increased carbon dioxide in spite of extremely warm weather. This might mean that the plants benefited due to the increase in leaf angle. An increase in leaf angle could provide more leaf surface area, which would promote photosynthesis process. We plan to observe this trend carefully in the fall. Next slide, please. Some of the restrictions that we faced with the COVID-19 pandemic, which restricted us from many of the resources that we were originally provided by the Randolph campus, including a well-ventilated and operating greenhouse, as well as the chemistry lab and faculty members that originally planned to help us. The greenhouse that we purchased was comprised of plastic and metal bars, which weren't well ventilated and created a poor conditions for our plants. Our budget, though generous, if higher, could have provided us with the money to purchase a well-equipped greenhouse that was well ventilated. Next slide, please. In the future, we tend to increase replications, quantify the chemical properties of toxin in the plants, identify health implications, monitor and observe nutrition properties within each treatment group, assess climate change impacts on agricultural industry. Next slide, please. We would like to thank the following people. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Sorry, guys, my sister-in-law just showed up and distracted me.
It's okay.
Okay, Blair, you have a question.
Hey, I was just curious. I had two questions actually. So when you talk about angle of the leaf, can you describe like what that means and like how it's measured and why it's good or bad? And then my second question is, what did you do with all the tomatoes and potatoes?
Okay, so when we're talking about the angle of the leaf, we're looking at the stalk of the stem, and when the leaf protrudes out of it, it creates an angle like this. So we use the protractor to measure that angle, and with a higher angle, you see that the plant is allowed to absorb more sunlight and also other things like carbon dioxide, which is a good thing. I'm sorry, I forgot your second question.
What do you do with all the tomatoes and potatoes?
Oh, okay. So for the tomatoes, we saved a piece of them, and we're gonna use that for our soil and analysis coming in August. And for the above ground, we dried them in ovens, and we use that to collect our biomass data. And the roots, we rinsed them out and we froze them. So we're gonna be able to do those, analyze those when we get back to school.
None of the plants bared any fruit though, so if you're asking about the tomato plant alone, we didn't get any of that because we learned that, you know, this condition is really harsh on the plants.
Well, that's a bummer. I was imagining like parties with making tomato sauce. So.
Other questions? I can't see if there are any hands up.
Kyle has
a question. Oh.
Kyle, you go first.
Okay, well, now I actually have two questions. Firstly, you said like the tomato plants and the potato plants got bigger during this, but you said they produced no fruit. I'm a little curious in just why that is. As you're talking about like the harsher conditions, is that because of the increased carbon dioxide levels? And that's kind of, I'll ask that first.
Within the time frame that we
so,
did oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yes, we're gonna tag team this. So if I miss something out, Renee, come in. But because of the conditions, so tomato plants, if they exceed above 95 degrees, they'll start flowering earlier. And therefore you won't really get any fruits because they're going in panic mode in the sense that they're trying to release all their nutrients and flower. So that's one of the reasons we didn't get any tomatoes, but the growth of the plant did increase within the 3 weeks that we monitored the plants. Any input, Renee?
And within the time frame, 3 weeks is a pretty short time to expect tomatoes to start sprouting. So we weren't really expecting for them to bear any fruit, really. And if we did expect that, we were expecting like maybe like little tiny fruits or something, but we didn't get any of that.
Okay, thank you for that. The other question I had is, so from my basic knowledge of climate, any type of change is going to benefit some and harm others. Can you all think of, are there some plants or maybe some crops that you guys like hypothesize that will really suffer from increased climate change in the coming years?
I can't think of one off the top of my head, to be honest. I just think plants, like more plants that can't really survive higher temperatures, or that yeah, like plants that need like lower temperatures and they can't really survive above temperatures of like 95, and those kind of plants would suffer most.
So, like as we said, these two agricultural plants are gonna have like a big effect just because of the toxin levels that it's gonna affect people's health and other aspects like that. When we did, when I was first going into this research idea, I was looking into teas. So a lot of tea bushes were just producing less bundles, or less, the width of the tea bushes were just smaller than usual, and there was like, that's going to eventually cause a decline in, or just a mass production in the tea industry. Also in tobacco plants, it's producing, there's a study released that showed that the nicotine level in the tobacco plants were increasing, which could be potentially a bad thing in the sense of tobacco users and just the effect in health. So those three plants, and just in general the nightshade family, is going to have an impact.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you guys very much. Dr. Schrager, did you have one quick question?
No, I was pointing out that Kyle had a question because I don't know if you were seeing it at that point.
Yeah, I did. Thank you. Okay, great job, you guys.
Dr. Soika did have a question though.
Okay, go ahead, Sarah.
I have a super quick one. Did you guys notice any differences in water stress or soil moisture or anything like that? I know it wasn't something you measured, but I know looking at the plants, you saw any differences in that under these conditions.
I could see that the ones with elevated temperature I had to water them a lot more often than the other ones. So yeah.
Thank you.
No problem.
That's a super helpful thing for those of us with gardens to know. Right? Any more quick questions? I think and you guys, if I miss your hand, please jump in, because I'm trying to monitor a lot of things. So I really appreciate you saying that, Kyle. Okay, so Zoe, you ready to go? Hang on just a second. Share screen. And I will mute.
Hi, I'm Zoe Waring, and I worked with Dr. Peter Sheldon this summer to create the SciFest curriculum guide. And we also worked with Dr. Peggy Schimler, who's the professor of education at Randolph College, and Jennifer Williams, who was the assistant director of the Science Festival for 2020. Next slide, please. So what I'll be talking about today is what SciFest is and how it relates to what we created, creating a curriculum guide, creating lesson plans, summarizing activities in SciFest, researching ways to assess the curriculum guide and the science outreach, COVID's effect on our whole setup, and then where the project will go into the future. Next slide, please. So SciFest began in 2005, but it began as something for students and young children from ages 3 until about middle school, and then it became a full-blown festival that we know of today in 2009, and everything in SciFest is geared towards the STEM. So the activities in SciFest this year for 2020 was Pi Run, which was a 3.14 mile run, and it goes in front of Randolph College. And then there was a keynote speaker who talked about his book, The Physics of Superheroes. There was a Women in Science panel, which were made of alums from Randolph and then the public could come to the science panel and ask questions, and they talked about their role in the way that their life is being a woman in science. There was a poetry competition that was for K through 12, and it was where students submitted a poem based on the sciences. Then the group of the SciFest interns and everybody judged them. And can you go back to that slide? And then there was a scientist goes to the movies, which was a movie, and then they discuss the science in the movie afterwards. Science Day and Little Scientists are from that age group that's 3 to middle schoolers that did hands-on scientific activities. And then Maker Faire and Science Sunday are on the last day of Sci-Fest, and Science Day was where students from Randolph and faculty put on hands-on scientific activities for people coming in from off campus, and Maker Faire did the same thing, but it was community-based and funded, and the sponsor of Maker Faire this year was Vector Space. And then the first Lego League Junior Expo is a competition that has to do with Lego robotics. Next slide, please. So what a curriculum guide is ours was a description of all of the activities of Sci-Fest, and then lesson plans based on those activities, and then all of that connected to the science standards of learning. Next slide, please. So first we summarized the events of Sci-Fest. So we took the activities that we knew, starting all the way from Pi Run and ended with Science Day, and we filled in those activities. And then the ones we didn't know, we contacted activity leaders about them so we could write descriptions, so we could create lesson plans later on. And then also the ones we didn't create lesson plans for every single activity, and that was because we wanted teachers to be able to take the activity from Sci-Fest and create their own lesson plans and adapt it to their classroom the best way it would fit. Next slide, please. So to create the curriculum guide, we researched SOLs, which are the Virginia Standards of Learning, and NGSS, which are the Next Generation Science Standards, which is national. So I had to do a lot of research on those. I went on to the Virginia Department of Education, and I read through all of the SOLs, basically from mathematics to science and even English, because poetry competition activities related to science and English. So then after that, researching the SOLs, I found activities that would relate to Sci-Fest and the STEM, because such as Pi Run, you can't exactly run 3.14 miles in a classroom. So you can see below, those are 2 examples of pre-K and kindergarten ones, and those are just a snippet. There's a lot more that related to Sci-Fest and the Pi Run, but were activities that could be done in the classroom. Next slide, please. So creating the lesson plans, on the right side of the screen, that is a blank template of our lesson plans that we used, and Jennifer Williams helped me a lot with that. And the template that we used was we took VDOE, which is the Virginia Department of Education plans, and Dr. Schimler's, and we kind of meshed them together for the best way to make ours. And it was related to SOLs again and NGSS. So I filled in, the strands and the topic, the primary SOLs, background info, materials, vocabulary, and what happens during the activity and what's needed for it. Next slide, please. So one of the bigger parts in the researching area was I had to research ways to assess the curriculum guide and the science outreach. So I read a lot of scientific journals and did a lot of library research to figure out the best way to assess this program. And I came up with doing a pre-assessment before one of our lesson plans or activities was done in the classroom, and doing a post-assessment to see how well the students understood the information afterwards. And another way to do that is to compare to a class that didn't do a lesson plan or activity, and you still do pre-assessments and post-assessments, and take those post-assessments and see which class understood the material better after the activity was over. And then teachers that did participate in the Sci-Fest curriculum guide would do a teacher survey afterwards, which I actually came up with survey questions and things like that. Something like, did the students seem to enjoy it? Did they learn, did they have more knowledge of the subject afterwards, and things like that. Next slide, please. So COVID did affect the program. We didn't have any in-person meetings with principals, teachers, or science specialists that we were planning on doing this summer. And then also there was a hesitation by the public schools to incorporate this program or this curriculum guide, because they had to make their whole fall plan, and it's hard to incorporate something new when you can't even have your own basis. And then also SciFest 2020 in last spring was canceled due to COVID. Next slide, please. So just to reiterate what I worked on, I did creating activities, filling out the curriculum guide and lesson plans. I researched SOLs, summarized the SciFest activities, researching ways to assess this program. And where the project will go in the future is this is not just a summer project. It's supposed to go to 1 to 2 years so that we can assess how well the students change by taking the SOLs and the NGSS. And then near the end of SRP, we started setting up meetings with principals and teachers to adapt this to the best way in the classroom in the fall. And then distributing the curriculum guide in the fall is where we want to be. And then Dr. Sheldon got grants to make this into a hard copy once it's all finalized. And then the really interesting thing is we decided that it would be a really cool and neat idea to create a website, almost like a database that is continuously growing. So the teachers that take those activities that didn't have lesson plans, once they create a lesson plan from that activity for their classroom, they can put that onto the website. So it's a continuously growing database of new lesson plans. And then next spring, hopefully by then, focus grouping with teachers on how well this curriculum guide worked, what they would change, different ideas and things like that. Next slide, please. And here are some of my references. Thank you for listening.
Well, this she's presenting. No. It came out the side.
Questions? Did anybody have can't see if anybody has their hand up. Jerry.
It's not a question, it's a comment. In case I don't get a chance to say this at the end of the day, people are doing a phenomenal job today, truly phenomenal. Every single one of them. With all the challenges that people face because of COVID-19, you wouldn't even know that because people are just doing such a great job. I just want to put that out there. So.
I just have a quick question. Were there any activities that were particularly difficult to move into the curriculum guide, or any types of activities that were particularly difficult?
So a lot of the SciFest activities actually weren't too bad, but it was more of like taking Pi Run and the poetry competition and kind of changing those and finding that was a lot of work trying to find activities that related to Pi Run and things like that. So I kind of did more of a Pi Day take on that. But that took a lot of research and a lot of work.
Thank you.
Kyle, you had a question?
Yeah, I actually had a question about the website. You said it was going to be a growing database. So are you going to manage the website, or is it somehow going to be kind of self-managing?
I actually don't really know that part because the biggest part of the project was getting it to be a hard copy. And then the website was kind of more of like, this would be a really cool idea. And so it wasn't a deep conversation about that. But I really think it would be more of, you wouldn't oversee everything. It would just be, this is our website and, where it all started.
Dr. Curry, I just want to tell you that your mic is muted, but I was trying to read your lips and it sounded like you said Blair, so I'm gonna take that as my cue. I just wanted to jump in terms of the website and just throw out a potential idea. We do have some programming classes at Randolph, and I could potentially see like connecting with students at Randolph to like manage and maintain the website. I think that would be a really cool. So that's just my idea. I'll throw that out there.
That is a really good idea, and there's a lot where we could go with that website. And teachers like hard copies, like we've talked about it with professors of education like Dr. Schimler, but the website would give so much more, and it would continuously grow instead of just having a hard copy that is just, it doesn't keep adding on to it.
to add on to what Dr. Gross said, it could be an internship for somebody every year. You know, you could get credits for, I mean, you could get education credits or you could get programming credits, because we're always looking for internships on campus. So maybe you and Dr. Sheldon can think about trying to develop that and talking to Megan Cruz about it, because she's always looking for ways to integrate students. So, okie dokie. Alrighty, so next we're gonna have Bryce and Nadia. Let me pull up your okay, Bryce and Nadia, you ready?
Yes.
Yep.
There you go.
All right. Well, I'm Nadia Tibbs, an environmental studies major.
Bryce Russell, an environmental science major, and we're both rising juniors at Randolph.
And our research over the summer we did with Dr. Soika, and we researched, I'm sorry, something popped up on my screen. We researched the impacts of seagrass restoration on ecosystem carbon storage. Next slide, please.
So one could say that both the image of the cars on all the traffic and all the pollution and the image of all the dead seagrass are both not the most visually appealing, especially compared to the picture in the middle. But one could also claim that both automobiles and seagrass can have similar pollution outputs. The image in the center displays Shark Bay in Australia, which was studied for its seagrasses. And a few years ago, a marine heat wave resulted in carbon emissions of as much as, I think it was 80 tons of carbon per hectare of the seagrass beds. And this could result in cumulative carbon losses of as much as 190 tons of carbon dioxide per hectare, as much as 40 years after the event. This carbon release is equivalent to the annual emissions from 400,000 to 2 million passenger cars. And to put that into more perspective, there are about 1.7 million cars in the city of San Francisco, California. So the amount of pollution caused from the death of the seagrasses in this little bay were about equivalent to the emissions from the cars of San Francisco. Next slide, please.
We know that seagrasses store and release carbon, but we are less sure about the mechanisms and duration of this carbon storage. What we really don't understand is the impacts of seagrass on adjacent areas of like sediment. Our project, our goal is to form a better understanding of carbon storage mechanisms and impacts that the seagrass beds have on their environment. Next slide, please.
So this image here is a diagram that explains how seagrasses store and release carbon. Basically, this starts when the seagrasses photosynthesize. They take in carbon dioxide, and then that carbon dioxide can be used to create more plant matter, like the seagrasses grow. So that stores some of the carbon dioxide, and then as the plant matter gets repurposed, like it gets eaten by other organisms or it dies, that organic matter, that carbon can get put into the soil and it can be held there. And that's another way that it can be stored. But also when the seagrasses die and they aren't consumed by other organisms or put into the soil fast enough, that carbon dioxide can be released back into the atmosphere as it decomposes. And so yeah, that's just how the seagrasses can take in and release the carbon. Next slide, please.
This is just a pretty picture of Hog Island. To the left is the Atlantic Ocean because it's on the eastern coast. Next slide, please.
Hog Island Bay is the part that's circled in the red there. You can see to the left Richmond and Hampton and all the big cities in Virginia for reference. But it is located off the Virginia Eastern Shore, and in the earlier 2000s, this site was an area of big seagrass restoration efforts. And we actually have data from when Dr. Soiko was in grad school, and she went to the same area and got data before the restorations. So comparatively, we were able to look at that data and compare it to data after the restoration to try to understand the impacts that seagrasses have on their environment. Next slide, please.
The brown pins are spatially distanced from the seagrass beds, and they were the important sites that we prioritized for our research. We use the word restored lightly because it is unclear how long it can take for the surrounding sediments to also be restored, and we don't know if these restoration efforts, we know when these restoration efforts were made, so the conclusions can be drawn from those data resources. To collect our samples, some nice people from UVA went and used a grab sampler to gather 3 replicates from each of our sites. Next slide, please.
For the methods of how we handle the samples, basically we got a sample site, and then there were the 3 replicates as mentioned on the previous slide. So there were 3 different bags of sediment. From each bag, we took a scoop of sediment and put it into one of the little aluminum tins that you can see all spread out in the pan there. And those samples were weighed and dried. And then after they were done drying, we incinerated them to burn off all the organic matter. And then after that was done, we reweighed the samples. And from there, we were able to determine the percent of the sample that was organic matter. And another thing we looked at for each of the samples and the replicates was the sediment grain size. So the image on the right, you can see we have a bunch of different size C's, and as the C's get lower, they get progressively smaller and smaller, so that we could separate the grains out by their size, and then also those once they were separated, we put the sediment into tins to also be dried and weighed again. And from there, we were able to find the composition based on grain size by a weight. So next slide, please.
This is just a map of the seagrass cover in the bay, and the blue regions indicate the seagrass, and the darker blue means it's more dense. The darker the blue, the denser. Next slide, please.
So here we have our data for the mud fraction of our samples from both 2002 and 2020. So mud fraction is the amount of each sample that has grain size of 63 microns or fewer. So this is just showing like the lower mud fractions are blue, as you can see by the scale in the middle, and the higher ones are in the red. And you can see how they sort of changed over the years and with the restoration efforts. But it's also important to note that in the middle of a bay, there is a channel that runs through it, and it comes out the bottom of, well, the southern tip of Hog Island. So the channel like carries water with it, but also carries sediment with it. And so that's why we weren't crazy surprised to see some variability like around that channel. Next slide, please.
We put the map side by side of the seagrass cover with the mud fraction results to analyze any patterns that we could see. It appears that overall there were increases in mud fraction at sites close to the seagrass beds and a decrease at sites further away. So if you look at the top of the map near, we can see that the orange indicates that there was a decrease in mud fraction at those sites. Next slide, please.
We also noticed some trends in the change in organic content. It appeared that there were increases in organic content in the sites closer to the seagrass beds, but there were one thing we weren't necessarily expecting to find were decreases in organic content at sites farther away from the seagrass beds. So that's something we're going to have to investigate with some further research to try to better understand why that happened. Next slide, please.
At first, we thought the seagrass beds might have a pretty big impact on carbon storage and the areas around the seagrass beds, but we think that these impacts, we might have overestimated these impacts. We're not sure why there was a depletion of organic content at the sites furthest away from the seagrass beds, so we want to further investigate why that could be a thing. And our research might help to improve further research and restoration efforts. Next slide, please.
This is just a thank you to everyone who
yes, thank you.
Funded us and let us make a big mess in their house with dirt. The end.
Hey, I have a question. So do you think that maybe the reduction that you weren't expecting could be due to fish feeding on the seagrass or something like that, just like one level up? So if you look at the fish biomass and that's bigger, then it's going to make the seagrass and other things decline?
Yeah, that was actually one of my first theories, because the seagrasses are a shelter for organisms. So once the shelter was reintroduced, I figured that the organisms would flock to that area to eat and to poop and to die. So their organic content would also be moved over there, is something that I had guessed. But another thing is that there is that channel in there moving the water around and moving the sediments around. So that could also play a big role in it. There are a lot of things that could be causing it actually, but we just don't know exactly what is doing that yet and to what extent each factor has on that. So, yeah.
Anna, did you have a question?
Yes, I did. Is my camera off or is it on?
It's off.
Oh, all right. I apologize. Here, hold on. There we go. Okay. So I had a quick question because I remember at the beginning of your research, I asked, what you all would maybe do to accommodate for any storms or anything that may skew your data. Did you guys experience any complications like that?
I don't think we experienced any complications having to do with it. That I don't think that storms had much of an impact over the past 20 years on these beds.
So, the storms would like stir up sediments and maybe cause some issues.
Can't hear you, Bryce.
Oh.
Your voice was just very low.
Oh, okay. Can y'all hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. So the storms would have an impact on the sediments a little bit. But as far as I remember, when our samples were collected, they weren't collected around any like significant storms that would have stirred up the sediments before the collection. So we do want to like recognize those impacts, but we do think that they are pretty insignificant.
Thank you.
I have a question. What kind of software do they use to make the overlays on the maps to show the density?
So I forgot what the software was called, but Dr. Soika could answer that.
So those maps that we showed were made in Tableau. The original shape files for the seagrass density are from ArcGIS.
And Kyle, you had a question?
Yeah, I just had a question if you could replicate this experiment in a controlled environment, or would that kind of take away from the point of the project?
Well, theoretically we could try to do it with just the seagrasses, and that would probably get us some better data for what we know just the seagrasses do. But in a controlled environment, it would be harder to replicate like the activity that the other organisms have and that the other organisms are having on the environment because of the seagrasses. So that would also be a lot more to have to worry about and to have to try to replicate.
And like tidal patterns and everything.
Well,
I
that's
think
what I was wondering about, like the sediment movement out through the ocean that you guys were talking about, or a storm that could affect it in some manner.
Yeah, those are things we try to consider in our research. But like I said earlier, the storms probably didn't have that great of an impact on our data. It was just probably a little bit of the channel, which we tried to mention and include in our reports.
You guys did a great job. Yay.
Thank you.
We have, I want to take a 5-minute break real quick. The students decided the other day that they didn't want to take an hour at lunch. They wanted to just go straight through. But I'd like to give everybody 5 minutes to stretch, because the next group is the 4 students who worked with Dr. Schenk, and they're going to be putting up their own presentation. So I want to give them a couple minutes to get set up, and everybody can take 5 minutes, and we'll come back at noon. And you guys go ahead. You're in control now.
All right. Hello, everyone. To introduce ourselves first, I'm Dagam Dasta. I am an engineering and mathematics major, and I'm a rising sophomore.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jacob. I'm a psychology major, and I'm also a rising sophomore.
Hi, I'm Jackson Powell. I'm an engineering physics major, and I'm a rising senior.
Hello, I'm Nicholas Vasquez. I am an engineering physics major, and I am also a rising sophomore.
And we have been working with Dr. Sheng to investigate the efficacy of current machine learning techniques for the analysis of mouse ultrasonic vocalizations. But before we delve into the depth of what we actually did for this summer research, we'd first like to relay some of the general significance and the societal impacts of our research. Next slide, please.
With that being said, many neuropsychiatric diseases are associated with various types of communication and/or social deficits. An example of this is an individual with some kind of autism spectrum disorder, as they have complications that can be attributed to the aforementioned deficits. Crucial to the study of these disorders are mouse models. Mice are used as forums for experimentation of various human disease. The use of the ultrasonic vocalizations in the assessment of mouse models of human disease has risen very sharply in the last 5 to 10 years and is rapidly becoming a standard behavioral test for communication and social deficits. Lastly, when mice vocalize, whether it be a male vocalizing to a female or a mother to a child, it is presumably to communicate. These vocalizations are mostly in the ultrasonic range, and the ultrasonic range is 20 kilohertz to 200 kilohertz. And the highest a human can hear is 20 kilohertz. So the majority of these vocalizations are not audible to the average human. Next slide.
In order to tell which are caused and which are not, we used a thing called spectrogram, which is the image you see at the bottom. And that is the graph of the frequency in kilohertz versus time in milliseconds. And the black bar towards the bottom shows you the limit of human hearing, which is 20 kilohertz. And the brighter the color is on the spectrogram, the louder the sound is. And as you can see, the ultrasonic mouse vocalization is far beyond the range that humans can hear.
So one of the most demanding and arduous tasks in this analysis is separating out the ultrasonic calls from the background noise through a process referred to as segmentation. These noises can include scratches, squeaks on glass, and various other things. And in order to curtail this, researchers have written codes to try to make this differentiation easier. Currently, the gold standard for doing this is by eye. Our goal for this research is to address that issue and provide researchers with information regarding the true performance of the main machine learning algorithms for data segmentation when compared against the gold standard. And the gold standard in this case is the by eye method. This will then allow researchers to make informed decisions about the analysis software that they're going to do when they do their own interpersonal analysis. Next slide.
One of the machine learning programs we will be analyzing is called MUPET. MUPET is a MATLAB-based tool to analyze the ultrasonic calls emitted by mice. It offers researchers the possibility to rapidly analyze audio recordings in terms of acoustics, spectral information, and syllable statistics.
Another fully graphical MATLAB package is called DeepSqueak, and this is used for detecting and classifying rodent ultrasonic vocalizations and is engineered to allow non-experts easy access to USV detection and analysis.
And the third one is the golden standard, which is also known as the by eye method, and it is a code that can be used to easily scroll through the sound data and tell if the calls are there or not just by using our eyes.
So for this project, myself and Dagam worked together to increase the robustness of the sound data by reviewing previously by eye segmented data collected by Dr. Shank and her collaborators in the past. Myself and Dagam reviewed roughly 7 to 10 past directories each and uploaded our edited segments to Dropbox for Dr. Shank to manipulate using her comparison algorithm juxtaposed against the data extrapolated by the MUPET and DeepSqueak interfaces. While segmenting, we discovered that the difficulty lies within the segmentation itself, as it's very difficult to differentiate calls from background noise, as we mentioned earlier. And along with the segmentation, data manipulation of any sort when working with surpluses of data is very time-consuming and strenuous. Next slide.
I worked with Professor Shank to prepare the data to be processed and run it through the machine learning program MUPET. The data needed to be processed because it was a file type int16. MUPET can only process files of type WAV. Professor Shank already had a MATLAB code to convert the files, but it was a long process and took a few days to run all the files through the program. Since I had the faster computer and was already familiar with how to operate MUPET, I handled converting the files while Nick focused on understanding DeepSqueak. One of the complications was transferring the files to Nick. The size of the data was too large to send over email, so I ended up removing my external hard drive and taking it to his house in person. After that, I could focus on running data through MUPET. However, while running MUPET, I came across several errors in the code. Professor Shank and I spent a few days debugging it. I was using the most recent version of MUPET, and to my knowledge, these errors still persist. Keep that in mind if you plan on using this program. After correcting the errors, I finished running the data through MUPET and exported all the data to be analyzed.
Hello, my assignment for this research project was also to convert the files given to TypeWav in order to run them through a program called DeepSqueak. After I transferred the files from Jackson's hard drive, I started running the files through the DeepSqueak algorithm, and I encountered a lack of code in two areas for the outcome we needed for this research. The first being that we needed to see how long it took the code to process each file to then be able to average up those times. The second issue was that when I exported the statistics of the call file, the file was in the wrong format, as it needed to be the main folder, the subfolder, and then the file name. After we fixed those problems, I was able to run the code and export the data with no issues. After running the data through MUPET and DeepSqueak, two of the outputs were the start times and the end times of the syllables detected by those algorithms. Using this and the start and end times we obtained from manually segmenting the data, we were able to write a code that gave a percentage of overlap of these times, thus showing us accurately the calls were identified. Here pictured is the gold standard in the orange box, which is by eye, and the MUPET and DeepSqueak is in green, and that is the codes that we ran through. And the blue box is the percentage of overlap, showing the difference between the two files, what is detected.
As you can see from the results, the percentage of accuracy is shockingly low for the two most widely used programs for this purpose. The highest degree of accuracy obtained from any of these codes, excluding the ones with no vocalizations in them, didn't even reach 70%. In a research environment, this is abysmal. Many neuroscientists wanting to segment their data without having to hire a legion of interns would download these codes and trust their results without a second thought. This could result in entire research projects being compromised and supporting false conclusions. This problem stems from a lack of understanding between those writing these codes and those using them.
Since we had no experience using either of the codes beforehand, we were able to objectively test their efficiency right out of the box. The people using these codes typically do not have coding experience, so they need to be highly they need to be highly operational and efficient when first downloaded without needing to change anything about the code or its settings. In that regard, MUPET already failed, being nearly unusable without us having to go into the code and correct several errors. MUPET's accuracy may have been noticeably better than DeepSqueak's, but considering that it required extensive knowledge of coding to even operate, it fails as a useful tool for non-coding literate neuroscientists to even use. In the future, programs like these should be developed by coders that are more knowledgeable of neuroscience, and neuroscientists should put more emphasis on learning the basics of coding.
For future research, we plan to verify and deeply analyze our results. We also want to try to tweak the codes to make them work for our data, and we'll try to use these algorithms to segment calls from other types of mice. After this, we'll write a paper regarding this research. Thank you for your time. We hope you enjoyed it.
Yes, and I would just like to go back and explain this figure. So the number of calls at the top is the gold standard versus DeepSqueak, so the by eye versus the code I ran it through. And it shows, gold standard minus DeepSqueak. So you can see some of the calls are below, and that is DeepSqueak having way more calls than what by eye, and vice versa for it being above. Then below that is the percent overlap between the two, which is what I showed you before in the analysis. And the 100% each one has an asterisk next to it because all of those 100% are, the gold standard says there's 0 files and the code says there's 0 files. So not really a 100% truly regarding these codes. And the same can be said for the MUPET down below on the last two. All right, any questions?
Yeah, if you guys could stop sharing your screen.
Yep.
Great.
There you go.
And first off, I just want to say, as somebody who has been teaching for almost 24 years, that was one of the best divisions of labor I've ever seen. You guys did amazingly well. It was wonderful to see all four of you speaking. You flowed really well together. And as a non-physics person, I could actually understand what you were saying.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to tell you that was really, really well done. It's not easy to do a presentation with 4 people, and you guys knocked it out of the park.
Thank you.
So questions?
How much data do we have to transfer?
Dr. Lindeman had a question.
Yes. How much data do we have to transfer?
About 400 gigabytes worth of data.
I think that's right. Yeah, it took several hours to transfer over.
Yeah, I had to physically take my extra and drive out to Nick's house for him to get it all.
Yeah, the hard drives we're using, the external ones, are 4 terabytes, just in case there was a lot of data to be transferred over, and there was in fact. So yeah, it was a lot and it took a while. So
Kyle, you had a question?
Yeah. In the beginning, y'all talked about how in the last 5 to 10 years, mice have been used more frequently to study developmental patterns in humans. I was wondering if you know why that is.
So are you asking why the use of these mice has kind of exponentially increased in the past 5 to 10 years?
Yeah,
So
what kind of changed?
basically, there is a lot of ambiguity in the actual vocalization itself. So there's not we don't have a complete and well-rounded understanding of why mice vocalize. We assume it's to communicate, because we have observed many situations where mother mice have vocalized to their children, our children have vocalized to their mothers, and they all normally are adamant in social situations. So from that, we have devolved that is presumably to communicate. However, there is no
and they're like more closer to humans, and yeah, that's why.
Yeah, let me just jump in. I'll just say it's not that there's more mice being used. It's that in mouse research, this idea of trying to assay communication or social deficits using their vocalizations, that's increased. So it's not the number of mice have increased, just what tests are being done to try to assay for communication or social deficits. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but what I was kind of asking, I got that part. I was asking why it's being used more frequently. Like, what is are the results more closely related, like Dagan was saying, to human behavior? Is that why, basically?
That's the hope.
Okay. And then I kind of had another question then. Cass, you're talking about how, a lot of we don't know exactly what the mouse.
You cut out. I didn't hear any of that.
Yeah, you're frozen.
Saying like what they're trying to say. So do you think that could have
Kyle, you're breaking up. Can you put it in the chat box?
data y'all gathered?
I think I saw Dr. Gross with her hand up, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, Kyle, can you type yours in? You're frozen. And then we're going to go to Dr. Gross.
Yeah, if y'all can hear that, I will.
Yeah, I was actually just going to jump in and say, I think also to tack on to what Dr. Schenk was saying, that I think a lot of the reasons why this research in terms of mice vocalizations has exploded is because there's been an explosion in research and interest in autism and the causes of autism. And so then vocalization is seen as a form of social behavior. And so as you know, people on an autism spectrum, that's often considered a deficit. And so that's what's prompting a lot of this research into that area. So it's sort of that driving factor. And you can, we can debate the ethics of this later, but, typically you can have a little bit more controlled studies in terms of turning genes on and off and things along those lines. So that's why. And that's all I want to say. Other than I think this is awesome and you did a great job.
Nadia, you had a
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask, like, what do you think that your biggest take from this research is?
Personally, I think my biggest take is realizing the disconnect between the individuals who write code and the individuals who use said code. Luckily, we've got a collaborator in Dr. Shank who is very experienced in both realms. And unfortunately, there aren't many individuals, even on the planet, who have as much experience both sides as she does. So we were very lucky to be able to have that kind of experience and output in both deviants of our research.
All right. Thank you.
I just wanted to add real quick, and then I'll get to Kyle's question. My brother is an internet guy, and he has developed quite a few companies in Silicon Valley, and I typed this into the chat box that what you just said about the disconnect between the creators and the users can be, I think, transferred to so many different disciplines. I was thinking about the Sci-Fest book, like the users and the creators are the same people, which is going to make that book really, really useful. But the fact that often people who create the tools we use have no idea what it's like to use them. And I think that's a really big problem in a lot of fields.
There's a certain, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
There's a certain mindset of the people creating these codes because they understand like the little intricacies of it. Like they understand like, oh no, you can't just do it directly out of the box. You have to, tinker with the settings a little bit, and you have to, it only can work with files of this size, and it makes sense to them. But coming from an objective user, it can appear just completely broken. And it's, like, there are probably many things that people on the Deep Squeak and MuPet team did that we didn't think of doing because we weren't the ones writing this code, and we were just like that was kind of the point of this test. This was our first introduction to the software, and just to see how it works from someone who's just directly downloading it from and see how well it works directly out of the box.
Your mic is off.
Dr. Shank answered Kyle's question, I think.
Yes.
So one other question, and I don't know if this is for you guys or Dr. Shank. I am a cat owner, and I have learned in the past couple of years that cats don't meow at each other. They meow at us for communication. When you have, and so I'm wondering have there been any studies on mice that are used as pets as opposed to either food for snakes or research material? Because I know my niece had a whole bunch of mice when she was growing up. Do mice squeak at human beings, or do they just squeak at each other?
That's a really good question. I don't think there's been any studies of mice as pets. There have been studies of rats as pets, which are very different animals. Mice are very smooth-brained, and rats are less so, let's just say. But there's been lots of studies of rats that they will, they're actually vocaling in the ultrasound when they're being tickled or played with, so by human. So that's very well established, but I haven't seen any studies. But I will say that a lot of the studies that are done with mice are done with what's called an inbred strain, which is a strain of mouse that's been purposefully inbred to the point where all of the mice are basically genetic clones, right? And that's very, very hard to do, as you can imagine, because it fails a lot, right, because of genetic problems. But that's what most people use. Now, the data that we used in this project are from what's called a wild-derived strain, which is not an inbred mouse, and it's a California mouse. And the interesting thing about this is that the California mice have a lot of vocalizations in the audible as well, many more than the inbred strain. So there is definitely differences due to inbreeding that people aren't really taking into account.
You guys did a great job. Thank you very much. So if all of you could mute your mics now. Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. So we're going to go from Nicole to Hannah to Josh. So Nicole, you ready?
Yes.
Okay.
Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes, ma'am.
Awesome.
Okay, I'm going to mute myself. Everybody see the screen? Can you see it? Okay.
Hello, everyone. I hope you're all well. My name is Nicole Headings, and I'm a rising senior at Randolph and also a psychology major. This summer, I had the pleasure of working alongside Dr. Gross and Hannah Edwards in 2 separate research projects. In our first research project, we investigated the gender differences in social support and slant perception. Next slide, please. To begin, people typically overestimate the slant of hills. Take Lombard Street in San Francisco, for example. A common estimate for this slant might be anywhere from 60 to 70 degrees, but it's actually only 18. So this is kind of weird, right, that we estimate the slant of hills. It turns out that we scale the hill slants based on the resources necessary to climb that hill. In other words, the harder that it may look to climb, the steeper it may look. Physiological changes such as illness, fatigue, or being older in age can also cause the hill slant to appear steeper. Next slide, please. Social support has some effects on perception as well, including the influence of physical and mental health. Social support can actually buffer the effects of the physiological changes such as illness and fatigue mentioned before. There are also some individual differences such as extroversion because, well, previous research has shown that introverts are less likely to seek out social support. And there are some gender differences as well. Human Falsey found in their research that women have more social support than men do and are more willing to reach out for it, whereas men are less likely to let others' emotions affect theirs. Next slide, please. So for a little bit of background, social support has been shown to affect the perception of hill slants. So imagining a positive social other can cause the perception of the hill to appear less steep. However, you can see in the graph below, this is from Dr. Gross's previous research, she found that only women responded to this theory, and you can see that the men had quite the opposite reaction to it. Next slide, please. So with all of this in mind, we hypothesized that evolutionarily, men who endorse more traditional gender roles will be less likely to respond to this social support manipulation and therefore perceive the hill slant as steeper. And for women, we suspected them to perceive it as more positive and less steep. Next slide, please. For our participants, we conducted a power analysis that indicated we needed about 84 to 91 participants. In total, we were lucky enough to have 131, and you can see the gender breakdown here. There was about 49 females, or 37.7%, 61 males, or 46.9%, and 20 unknown, 15.3%. Oh, sorry, could you go back? We didn't originally offer incentives, but we noticed that we were having a lack of responses, so we went ahead and put our survey on Mechanical Turk, which is a survey platform, or it's a platform where you can link your survey and it pays the participants money. So for each participant that took the survey through Mechanical Turk, they earned $3. However, those who received the survey through email or found it through social media, etc., they were not paid. Next slide, please. For our measures, they were assigned to an imagery task in either we had 3 conditions of this task, a positive, neutral, and negative. They were then asked to give slant estimates with this protractor. And with each protractor was a different photo of a hill. So they were asked to kind of match up the hill and the protractor. For example, if I thought the hill in this photo corresponded to the black line, I would report the color yellow and the number 11. They immediately after the visual estimate, they were asked a verbal estimate of how steep the hill is from 0 to 90 degrees, where 0 is flat and 90 is a vertical wall. Afterwards, they answered a series of questionnaires which were randomized by Qualtrics for us. Next slide, please. So a little bit more randomization. We had, for the study and design, Qualtrics, we programmed it to separate the participants into two different groups. The first group took the series of randomized questionnaires and then moved on to the Hill Slant where they gave their estimates, and then on to the manipulation check where they were asked who they imagined and how long they had known them and things about the social other. And the second study, the second group, they flipped and did the slant estimates first, then the manipulation check, and then on to the series of randomized questionnaires. Next slide, please. Okay, on to the fun part, our results. We didn't exactly find what we hypothesized. We found that gender went kind of in an opposite pattern than we thought it would, and this has never happened before, so that was really interesting to see. In this graph, you can see on the y-axis was the verbal slope estimate, and on the bottom was it shows the condition that they were assigned to. And you can see that the more happier they felt towards the imagined other, the lower their Hill Slant estimates were. Next slide, please. And this slide is the same feelings of happiness, the feelings of happiness. On the y-axis, we have the verbal slope estimate, and on the x-axis, we have the feelings of happiness. And you can see that women underestimated the hills compared to men in these scatter plots. Nonetheless, these feelings of happiness towards that social other are still were shown to be predictors of hill slants. Next slide, please. For the last significant finding that we saw, masculine power over women, which is a subscale in the masculine inventory we provided, or one of the inventories we provided, sorry, can also predict hill slant estimates. And you can see that the y-axis is slope estimates again, and the x is power over women. And the negative condition at the top right corner it really drove this prediction, you can see. So men who had higher slant estimates they reported lower feelings in power over women. Next slide, please. In conclusion, although we did not replicate previous research with the gender interaction and social support, we did find that feelings of happiness towards the social other and masculine power over women can predict hill slant estimates. For future research, we would love to replicate this study in person because we believe that there might have been some difficulties translating all of these, especially with the hill slant and the protractor use. It might have been a little more confusing than helpful. So recreating this in person might provide different results. We would also really like to explore the demographics more in an exploratory analysis. And that's all I have for y'all. Thank you.
Questions? I did have one question. I don't know if you guys took into account age differences, or were you just looking at gender and sex?
So I think we did have a pretty decent age range. We weren't, Dr. Gross might be able to provide more information, but we didn't really look at the age, just between women and men.
Okay.
I did do analysis where we looked at age as a factor because we have found in the past that elderly groups tend to overestimate the sense of hills compared to younger populations. But we had we had a really good widespread in terms of range, but our mean was 30. And so putting it as a covariate didn't really tell us anything.
Do I think there was a difference in paid versus non-paid? Let me think for a second.
That's an interesting question.
That's a really good question. I don't think so. For the Mechanical Turk survey that we had, the surveys were completed, because if they weren't completed, they wouldn't have received the money. But when we sent it out through email or posted it on social media, we had a lot of unanswered areas, and some we had to completely exclude because they had maybe signed the informed consent and didn't finish the rest. So we actually had more information from the paid group versus the non-paid. Do you think your results could lead to how/if people's perspective changes online versus in person? I think definitely. Just, I think it's, like I said in my presentation, it's kind of hard to translate because that visual protractor can be really confusing. So I think the perceptions would definitely be different if it was conducted in person.
Myself. That was awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions? And now we're going to move on to the other half. And just so you know, I actually did pull names out of a hat. So it's funny that Nicole and Hannah ended up being back-to-back since they worked together. I did not do that intentionally. So we're going to move on to Hannah.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Courier. Hello, everyone. My name is Hannah Edwards, and I'm very excited to talk to you all about how I spent our 8 weeks of summer research, which focused on finding potential predictors for how we act during a pandemic. Next slide, please. So I worked with Dr. Gross and Nicole Headings. We all worked together and expanding our literary basis for getting knowledge on the subject beforehand. And this is also a branch continuation of Dr. Gross's previous work with Dr. Tatum on cheating behaviors. Next slide, please. So our hypothesis is rooted in the idea based from Schnall in 2008 and in further research that disgust sensitivity and morality are connected in the sense that morality is derived from disgust sensitivity as a means to protect the physical form. So, and when we talk about disgust sensitivity, we are referring to how sensitive you are to gross things like rotten meat or someone getting sick or sneezing, you know, not very pretty stuff. However, continue along the same vein, it has also been associated that if you have higher risk-taking behaviors, so, you know, you're not afraid to touch gross things or you're not afraid to rock climb, you know, you are not as sensitive to disgusting things and may have a lower morality. With this background information, we have derived our hypothesis. Participants who self-report in high disgust sensitivity and high morality and have low risk-taking attitudes will exhibit more conservative pandemic behaviors. And what we mean by more conservative pandemic behaviors, we're referring to strictly wearing a mask, not socializing, quarantining, compared to less pandemic behavior, or less conservative pandemic behaviors. So not wearing masks, going outside, hugging everyone, etc. And vice versa on the same vein. So if you are low in disgust sensitivity and morality and high in risk-taking, you will exhibit less conservative pandemic behaviors. Next slide, please. So on to our participants. We gathered a total of 80 responses from various sites, as you can see from our pie chart, which included the Randolph portal, Facebook, and Randolph Connect. And a large majority of our participants came from email, and that is included in the other category, as you can see. In terms of the email, Dr. Gross, Nicole Headings, and I sent it out on our social media platforms and to past students or friends. Again, in total, we had 80 responses. However, due to some complications, we had to exclude 12 data sets. We excluded this data due to some participants either not agreeing to the informed consent document or not completing the survey fully. In total, that means we ended up with a 67% participants respondents, and that was 63 females, 13 males, and 1 non-binary individual. And our ages ranged from 18 to 70. Next slide, please. So for our slides, or for our measures, we did multiple tests. The first 4, in terms of like the DOSPERT, the moral foundations, and the moral disengagement and the discuss sensitivity, all of those were Likert scales, labeled from 0 to 4. So disagree to agree. We compiled all this information within Qualtrics, and that's where we made the survey, and we published it and sent it out via links. In terms of risk-taking, which used the DOSPERT for its measurement, we asked participants a series of like vignettes on how they would feel about doing certain activities. For example, say going camping in the wilderness, or betting an entire day's income on horse racing. Anything that could pose a health risk, a safety risk, or a financial risk. Moral Foundation Questionnaire and the Moral Disengagement Scale are pretty self-explanatory. They were used to measure participants' morality. Same as said with the Discuss Sensitivity Scale. So asking how grossed out would you be in certain situations, like eating monkey meat or having someone sneeze on you. The last 2 are a little different. They are not Likert scales. The pandemic behavior categories were ranged from 0, very strict, to 5, very open. And they proposed a series of behaviors that participants were asked to assign themselves to in their behaviors. Political ideology label was also used to, again, gather political ideology information, as we suspect that it might be confounded. And to process our data, we did correlations as well as ANOVA analysis and SPSS to gather our data. Next slide, please. So here's an example of the pandemic behavior categories that participants were met with. As you can see, we have the opposite ranges of the spectrum. So 0, very strict, 5, very open. And again, participants were asked to assign themselves to what their behavior was most like during the current COVID pandemic. Next slide, please. And here is our political ideology label, which is again presented to participants. It ranges from 1 to 7, very liberal to very conservative. And if our participants' political ideology was not listed in this label category system, they were asked to identify it as below. The political ideology label, the pandemic categories, and all of our other measures were presented in random order to participants, so it varied from taking to taking. Next slide, please. The fun part, the results. Next slide, please. So here we have a pandemic behavior correlation chart. Now, the pandemic behavior correlation chart, these, well, first, I should initially start off with what a correlation is. Pardon me. A correlation is looking at how 2 or more variables associate with each other. What's their relationship? And these relationships can be positive or negative. So positive is where as one variable increases, the other variable does as well. Whereas a negative correlation is where one variable increases, another variable decreases. So as you can see here from the positive number under the Moral Foundations Questionnaire in the Pandemic Behaviors category, we have a positive correlation that is indicative by if there's, you know, a positive or a negative symbol in front of it. So what this specific correlation stands for in terms of the moral foundation under the subscale of fairness is that it actually was an opposite finding than what we were expecting. So this correlation means the higher you scored under fairness, the more open your pandemic behavior was, which is opposite from what we were expecting, and that higher morality means lower pandemic behavior category. Moving on, we have a negative correlation, and that is for the Discuss Sensitivity Scale in the pandemic behaviors categories. It shows that the lower you scored in the Discuss scale, means, or the less discussed that you reported means the less strict pandemic behaviors you had, which is aligned with our original hypothesis. Furthermore, to the DOS score, as you can see, we have another positive correlation. So the higher that someone had scored in risk-taking means the more open they are to pandemic-related behaviors being less conservative. Next slide, please. So here are two of the interesting findings that we were not actually expecting, but were quite a delight to find. So for the first graph on the top, for our y-axis, we have average pandemic behavior category. And for our x-axis, we have political ideology labeled. And from this graph that you can see that it seems that your political ideology may be able to predict your average pandemic behavior category. So from the graph, as you can see, hopefully, the more conservative you are, the more likely that you will have a more or less conservative pandemic behavior. Going on to the gender, which is below the political ideology graph, again, we have average pandemic behaviors category on the y-axis, and we had gender on the x-axis. It seems that males are more likely to have more open pandemic behaviors, or less conservative pandemic behaviors, rather than females. Next slide, please. So what does this all mean? Well, this provides suggestive evidence that morality, discuss sensitivity, and risk-taking may be related to pandemic behaviors as we thought initially in our hypothesis. However, due to the small sample size, replication would be fantastic to ensure the external validity of the test, to make sure that we can generalize it to the greater population and the findings of the study. Furthermore, gender and political orientation has showed to possibly predict pandemic-related behaviors. And again, we would love to do the same test and see if we can replicate these findings, see if we can apply them to the broader population. And this information would be very valuable to health organizations, news organizations, to kind of give an idea of possibly what demographics are most at risk for spreading whatever pandemic may be next. Hopefully not another COVID. Fingers crossed. Next slide, please. And that is it. Thank you all for listening. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about our study. Dr. Curry, your mic's off.
My question is, if I heard this correctly, what your research found was that the more conservative you are politically, the less risk-taking you're going to take with pandemic behavior. So that you're more likely to wear, did I hear that correctly? So if you're conservative politically, you're going to be safer in the pandemic, or is it the way around?
Other way around. So the more conservative that you are politically, the less conservative you will be pandemic behavior.
Which is what we're seeing all around the country. And I can tell you, having come from Virginia up to New England, in New England, almost 100% of the people wear masks.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot go into a store without, they won't let you in the store. They prevent you from going into the store.
Mm-hmm.
And yet you see the pictures in Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, people are wandering around, rubbing up on each other, not wearing masks. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and in terms of the gender, just to clarify if that wasn't clear, and I apologize, males are more likely to have less conservative pandemic behavior. So I see I have a question from Elena. Did your survey allow you to discern any role of scientific literacy on the part of respondents in determining COVID behaviors? I don't know if I'm understanding your question correctly. Your survey allowed you to discern any role? So from what I understand, no. We, just asked participants just flatline what were your COVID behaviors, not if they had been listening to the news. But we did ask them if they had a considerable, or like a job that was considered essential. So if they were doctors and stuff, and I believe we do have some more tables of correlations that may show something like that. But again, I don't think we asked anything about scientific literacy, but we did have a wide range of participants, and we asked them, you know, what their highest level of education was. So maybe you can infer it from that. You know, we had doctorate, bachelor's degree, master's, that, which actually did take up a large portion of our participants, which, again, not as diverse as we would like, but it's what we got. Does that answer your question, Elena? Oh, hi, Dr. Warren. I'm sorry. I did not mean to call you by your first name.
Well, actually, it's her
You
daughter.
didn't, Hannah. My daughter was using the account this morning. I forgot to rename it.
Okay, I was so worried. Okay, wonderful.
Don't worry about it. It's summer. Things are more casual. Thanks for your response, Hannah. I dropped some more comments in there. And I think this is a really interesting study. I'd love to talk with the three of you more about it this fall if you're interested in looking in. There have been a lot of studies coming from people's beliefs about climate science and political leanings. There's a lot published about that. You can use data from the Yale public opinion surveys, and it might be a next step in the research that could be really intriguing. So thanks for your answer.
Yeah. Oh, of course.
That's a great idea, Dr. Warren. I think I would love to connect up, because we're definitely planning on running a follow-up here in terms of getting a more diverse sample and things along those lines. But I had originally included the political ideology, obviously for, you know, standard reasons, right? Given the distance between conservatives and liberals right now, and how they're both like pushing pandemic behaviors, but also because of John Haidt's work in political ideology and morality. So it turns out there's some correlations there where the kinds of things that you consider is more important in terms of a moral space predicts political ideology. So it turns out that if you are, if you ascribe more to moral authority, you're more likely to be conservative or self-identify as conservative, which I thought was interesting too. So, but yeah, I didn't think about in terms of scientific literacy. That'd be great.
Okay, Dr. Soika had a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question about how fixed is disgust sensitivity thought to be? Because I think about my own life, say, like I used to be a medic. My disgust sensitivity was much higher before I spent a lot of time in the back of ambulances with people vomiting. And I got pretty okay with it. Similarly, parenthood has dropped my disgust sensitivity just to levels. I'm seeing some other parents nodding their hands, or people that have been around kids a lot. It changes a lot because it's disgusting. And you get kind of used to disgusting. And so I guess I wonder how fixed that is, or how malleable it is based on experiences, and then how that would impact it as a predictive factor.
No, that's a great question. And personally, I don't think we had anything in terms of, you know, they were just vignettes, and it was just the basic of stuff and how you would respond. And one of them was like touching a dead body or being thrown up on. So it seemed to cover a very wide, disgusting topic range. But that definitely is interesting, and I agree with you. I think it'd be interesting to see, you know, what is a 20-year-old's disgust sensitivity who doesn't have kids, who wasn't a medic or anything of that sort, compared to someone who's maybe later in age. So that's a really good question, though.
Thank you.
Okay, from Dr. Howell.
Dr. Howell had a great question.
Yeah. You can
I
go
was
ahead, Dr. Gross.
I was just going to jump in to say to Dr. Soika, that has, to my knowledge, that hasn't been studied, so it's a fabulous idea. I'm getting all kinds of ideas for research, which is great. But I would expect that it would be both. That there's some individual differences where people are going to be higher in disgust sensitivity than others, but then there's probably also going to be a state component where if you have more experience in terms of that, and I echo your sentiments as a parent. Also, I've done some pretty disgusting things, and I won't say gross, but I've done disgusting things, so I echo it.
And about Dr. Howell's comment, so just as Dr. Gross just said, it's seen that those who are more politically conservative tend to adhere to the moral foundation of authority. So authority sort of has more of an impact on their behaviors. And I think that would be the recommendation that, further research would hopefully most definitely be able to confirm for you. But just from our research and what I know based off of that connection, I would say definitely having more authoritative set standards for, social distancing and guidelines, not saying, oh, you can, but it's more of a, you need to. You have the authority figure telling you, you need to do this. So, did that answer your question?
I actually just typed into the box one of the interesting things that you just related to, Hannah, which is also very sociological and psychological, is the different authorities and how people in the US are getting different messages from different authority figures. And which ones are they choosing to listen to? Like, I'm listening to Fauci and the CDC, and other people are listening to Trump. So that would be an interesting study when you have experts that are contradicting each other. The conservatives in our country seem to be rejecting the medical profession, but listening to the president, right? They're not listening to the people who actually have medical knowledge and scientific knowledge. They're listening to the figurehead. And yet, I just think that, like, when experts combat, who do people listen to? And I wonder how much that has to do with political leanings too.
No, and that's a very fair point, because again, I remember when the beginning of COVID sort of happened, a lot of health organizations and efforts to conserve masks for, essential workers said, you don't need to. And then it shifted to, maybe you should, to, we really recommend you wear a mask. So it's definitely interesting on findings. Dr. Linderman, thoughts on helping humankind over political? I feel like this, one of the things I really love about this research is that it's very extendable to, a lot of fields. And I think that's more a different kind of like humanitarian psychology. But, I think it's going to be a learning process, as it has been. Same with summer research, learning how to adjust and get used to how COVID has changed things. Helping humankind as a whole, I think, it's going to have to be it's going to be different for a lot of places. Because again, like we were saying, some people adhere to authority. Some people adhere to fairness in terms of morality. I don't think there's a one size fits all, but I feel like there's definitely a standard that we need to find in terms to help, regardless of political ideology. Let's see. I think, is that everyone? Did anyone else have any questions?
I think the chat is now all of us sort of mirroring the same political spectrum.
Yeah.
So
no, but
thank you, Hannah.
Thank you.
And now we're going to move on to Josh, and that was fabulous. And Josh, are you ready, my friend?
I am ready, Dr. Courier.
Okay, hang on just a second. And we didn't plan it this way, but I do think it's appropriate that we circle all the way back to studying Lynchburg and studying the Rivermont area, and that Josh is giving the last presentation on the preservation of Rivermont Ave, our beloved home. So here you go, and I will mute myself.
All right, thank you again, Dr. Courier. My name is Joshua Belofko. I worked with my history professor and academic advisor, Dr. Shareko, this summer, and it's my pleasure to present our summer research project titled History and Historic Preservation of Rivermont Avenue and Beyond. Hope you enjoy it. Next slide, please. So just to give everyone an idea of what our purpose was with this project, we really wanted to spread the message that old places do in fact matter. We wanted to do this by sharing stories of Lynchburg's history, particularly that of Rivermont Avenue, from current and past residents. The process of reviewing and assembling narratives for the Friends of Rivermont Historical Society website, which I personally did myself, Dr. Shreko sent me 5 flash drives worth of interviews, which was about 20 recordings in total with past and present Rivermont residents. And then we collaborated to create captivating narratives for all interested parties to enjoy, especially public history enthusiasts in Lynchburg, as well as present residents and business owners that might be interested in the history of their properties. Next slide, please. Oh, one more point. It is extremely important to recognize the history of the Avenue in these tumultuous times that we are all living in with the virus, as well as the protests and all the movements going on. So the Friends of Rivermont website refresh, we knew when we started this project that we needed to refresh the website. And we sought the help of Stimulus, which is a marketing and web design company, to improve the appearance of the website. This was very challenging just because there was so much to do, and also the fact that many of these changes would take time and financial resources. The changes, of course, would make the website easier to use and understand, as well as make it more appealing to the eye. Once this was done, we were able to perform research on ownership histories of each and every property in the 3 sections of Rivermont Avenue: lower, middle, and upper, utilizing city resources, as well as paper records that Dr. Shreko had previously compiled with previous SRPs. Online city resources only went back so far, of course. I then created an Excel sheet with a wide variety of information, including addresses, property names, types of property, present owners, previous owners, etc. And then I updated the ownership histories for all 275 properties on Rivermont Avenue, while Dr. Shreko updated much of the anecdotal information for each structure. And it was certainly remarkable to see how and when people own these properties. Next slide, please. So before I talk about assembling the narratives themselves, Rivermont was one of the first designed suburbs in Virginia, and it's really important to know the history of it. We then were able to humanize history on the avenue with stories of people that lived and did business on Rivermont. This is extremely relevant, as it is important to recognize the facts of Southern history to ensure that injustices like those of the Jim Crow era, or even modern times, are never replicated again. And continuing on with that, select narratives did definitely touch on issues of race throughout Lynchburg's history. Next slide, please. So let's begin with one of those narratives that we were able to complete. This is Annie Massey. She was born at Virginia Baptist Hospital in 1931. The hospital is located at 2216 Rivermont Avenue. Many of you pass it when you're going towards Link Road. It is right there, very close to the college. She spent all but a few of her 83 years in Lynchburg. Unfortunately, she did pass away in 2015. In the interview, she talked about her childhood, sledding on Norfolk Avenue, roller skating, going to school at Garland Roads, etc. She was an admirer of the arts since her days at Garland Roads. She became an incredible artist herself. Annie first attended St. Mary's Junior College in North Carolina, and later transferred to Randolph Macon Women's College, where she was an English major with a minor in Latin and Greek. Though she and her husband, William, met in high school, they moved to Charlottesville temporarily and then moved back to Lynchburg in 1963. When we got to the 90s with Annie, she talked about the struggles that came with naming Rivermont Avenue a historic district. It took 2 tries in city council meetings to finally, for them to recognize the merits of naming Rivermont Avenue a historic district. And this is her childhood home pictured at the lower right, which is at 1700 Rivermont Avenue. Her maternal grandfather had purchased that around 1902, and this is where she grew up. And then 3204 is where her and her husband lived for many years. And she was president of both Friends of Rivermont and the Lynchburg Historical Foundation. Next slide, please. This is Bob McDaniel. He was born at the same place in 1936. Let me flip my notes here. Which I mentioned before, was right down the road from Randolph. He passed away in 2018. And what really stood out in this interview was the African-American housemaid, his family's African-American housemaid, Emma. And she was really the one that raised Bob. He loved her, he really did. She was the one that walked Bob to Garland Rose School each day. And he then went into talking about how he would regularly frequent the Jones Library, which is right over the Rivermont Bridge. We pass it when we're coming from downtown. And this library was sensational. Unfortunately, like many establishments in the South at the time, the Jones Library barred African Americans from coming in or checking out books. Moreover, African Americans were not even allowed on the avenue for many years unless they were in uniform heading to work. Though downtown has been revitalized in the past few years, many stores were affected by the rise of the Wards Road area, the River Ridge Mall, as well as local shopping plazas. And he did point out the various stores there in downtown that had to leave: JCPenney, Sears Roebuck, Guggenheimer's, and even on Rivermont Avenue, the Piggly Wiggly grocery store, Katie Mundy's Columns restaurant, which is now the Randolph College admissions office, and Rivermont Pharmacy. Next slide, please. All right, this is probably my favorite narrative, I will have to say. This is Dr. William Quillian. He was born in Nashville, Tennessee in 1913. He became the president of Randolph-Macon Women's College in 1952. He lived at the old president's house, which is actually closer to the college than the current address, 2460 Rivermont Avenue. He's pictured there with his wife, Margaret. Dr. Quillian mentioned that he hosted many important figures at this house, such as Pearl S. Buck and Elizabeth Taylor, whose husband, John Warner, was campaigning for a Virginia U.S. Senate seat at the time. And this is a seat that he actually held for over 30 years. Under Dr. Quillian's leadership, the college increased financial support with the connection to the Methodist Church. When this happened, multiple building additions became possible, such as the Bell Residence Hall, the Houston Chapel, new athletics facilities, the Mayer Art Museum, which is affiliated with the National Gallery, and the Leggett Building. Though controversial, Quillian directed the Board of Trustees to eliminate sororities due to their questionable reputation in the community. And most importantly, Dr. Quillian integrated the college. Many community members at the time were frustrated with Dr. Quillian's progressiveness. We, of course, view him differently nowadays. The News at Advance, the local newspaper in Lynchburg, repeatedly questioned Dr. Quillian's actions. So they referred to an event where Dr. Quillian, or actually the school itself, hosted a YWCA African-American speaker on campus as a quote-unquote disturbance. And then he also did support student sit-ins. He brought materials to the students so they could keep on learning and so they could keep on being students at Randolph-Macon Women's College. He was an amazing man. Dr. Quillian passed away, unfortunately, in 2014, shortly before his 101st birthday. Next slide, please. This is Muriel Casey. She is pictured on the left. She's pictured with Heather Garnett and Rebecca Dixon. She received an award with them a couple of years ago. She is the class of 1953. She left New York City to come to Randolph-Macon Women's College in 1949. She mentioned that she was rushed into a sorority within her first week on campus, which seems crazy to me. So much going on, you know, you're getting used to the college and then you're rushed into the sorority. And it's crazy. But Muriel said that she immersed herself in many elements of college life in Lynchburg. She participated in athletics, Smith Hall theater performances, had nights out at the Paramount and Isis theaters downtown. She also said that finding good food wasn't a problem, as all residence halls on campus had their own chef. There were many good restaurants in town as well, such as the Virginian Hotel and Katie Mundy's Columns, which again, right across from the college. And it was a great place to take the family when they were visiting. She did mention the fact that the Cavalier, which I love personally, and the Blue Dahlia were off limits to Randolph-Macon Women's College for many years, just because of their questionable reputations in the community. They were kind of sketchy. She married William Mallon Casey Jr. in the summer after graduation. They lived on North Princeton Circle and then 1919 Rivermont Avenue. She worked at the all-female Seven Hills School on Rivermont Avenue before coming back to the college to direct the efforts of the Randolph-Macon Women's College Alumni Relations House from 1972 to 2003. The college was evolving during this time, such as I mentioned with Dr. Quillian, building additions and renovations, the ender sororities, as well as recent integration. She did such a great job in this position that the alumni house was later named after her because of her dedication to the college. And she volunteered and participated with various organizations throughout her career there, and she still continues to volunteer with them today. Next slide, please. This is Dr. Clifton and Dorothy Potter. Clifton's story in Lynchburg began very early on. He was born at Marshall Lodge Memorial Hospital on Grace Street. He lived at 456 Rivermont Avenue with his family for quite a few years. This is the old George and Mary Jones house. He discovered secrets at the house, heard strange sounds, which he later found out to be an elevator used by George Jones. Hold on, let me address that. So sorry about that. So sorry. So at the house, he discovered secrets at the Jones house. He heard strange sounds, which he later found out to be an elevator used by George Jones to get upstairs, but it had long since been removed. Another ghost story on the avenue? That's up for interpretation, but I believe so. Clifton mentioned that he had an incredibly useful job at the Jones Library. This is where he furthered his passion for academia. He never got lost in a library ever again, even when they moved to England, where Clifton had a Fulbright grant at the University of Oxford. Both Clifton and Dorothy attended Lynchburg College, which is now the University of Lynchburg, and they would both return to the school to teach until their retirement in 2018. Issues of race were definitely present throughout their lives. Clifton's Yankee grandmother protested after being told to move from a seat next to an African-American woman on the Rivermont trolley. She reluctantly agreed to avoid a violent conflict. And Clifton himself was also a target of abuse at E.C. Glass High School for his progressive views to desegregate schools. Both were and have been very courageous in their fight against the stigma of racism in the South. Next slide, please. So some of you may ask, so what? Why should we care about these narratives? And I would argue that it has never been more crucial for us, especially in these tumultuous times, to better understand the past so we can move forward, not to mention the fact that there are clear benefits in humanizing history. It's easier to learn history from people that lived in the moment. They unlock doors to our past. Some may be uninterested in a list of facts, but these stories are far more vivid and simply just fascinating. It's never been more important to understand the truth of how life was for African Americans in the South and how it still is. We must push to complicate the master narrative, the overarching story. We can look back on these businesses that were on the avenue with nostalgia and always be thinking about how things once were everywhere we go. Dr. Shreko and I set out to spread awareness of the benefits of the fact that Rivermont Avenue is a historic district. And the purpose of this project was extremely important to us, with our continuous hope to inspire more individuals to get involved with the efforts of historic preservation. Thank you all so much. Sorry about the phone ringing. I don't know, perfect timing, right?
Was that actually a landline, Josh?
Yeah, we still have one of those in our house.
Okay, questions from anybody?
Let's see.
Hi, I have a question.
Yep, Alicia.
So, when researching Rivermont and determining it to be a historical place, how do you think it would compare into other, I don't know if it's a city, other cities within Virginia or even the United States when it comes to how important it is to shed light on these small towns, especially compared to bigger cities and their contributions towards any historical inference of what it was like during certain time periods.
Right, that's a very good question. It's important when people think about Virginia history, they think about Richmond, they think about the big cities, but Lynchburg still has a lot of history, particularly with issues of race, that we must recognize and address, and truly not overlook. We can't ignore anything like that. So it's very important to make sure these facts are out there, make sure these stories are out there, so more people know about the city that they live in and go to school in. Let's see, look in the chat box here.
Question. Did you find reference to the red brick wall in any of your reading?
I can't say that we did. I mean, I know there used to be an actual gate at the front of campus. That's since been removed. It's just the driveway. But yeah, it's been there for a while. I know that. It would be interesting to learn more about the history of the red brick wall and why it's there. I know one of the common things we hear as students is make sure you get outside the brick wall, experience the world, and yes, I would love to love more about the history of it. And maybe Dr. Shreka and I could work on that in the future. Jody, see if there's a question here. See that you mentioned Marina affiliation stories. What are any properties, sources that? Yes, so there were sorority houses actually more towards the Dell. And I think one is still standing. It's used for something else now. It's right above the Dell. But of course, many sorority houses weren't, they were torn down after they were eliminated. And some of them were actually almost uninhabitable, even when they were torn down. So yeah, there were a lot of them actually also where the Bell parking lot is now. So, yeah.
I had a question too, because I live a block off of Rivermont, but my house was built in 1904.
Mm-hmm.
I live on the same road with Dr. Soika and then Dr. Warren and Dr. Rodriguez. Dr. Soika and I both live in old houses. Is there anything on the houses that are just a block off Rivermont, or has most of the research been done on the houses that are actually on Rivermont?
Right, so we've mostly focused on the houses that are directly on Rivermont. I would love to look more into the histories of the houses that are just a block off, like you said, because they have stories too, and I think it would be really interesting to gather more information about those as well. Do you plan, this is Hannah's question, do you plan to continue expanding the number of interviews in the future after COVID? Yes, absolutely. We're definitely limited in how many people we were able to interview during these times. We actually weren't able to gather any new interviews because I was in Maryland, Dr. Shureiko's still in Lynchburg, of course. But our goal is maybe next year we can even gather more interviews for sure, and we would love to expand the stories. Dr. Schenk?
Yeah, hey, so I actually live on Rivermont. I don't own the house, but the house is a duplex, and I thought that was really interesting and weird. It was, I think, built in 1910, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's side-by-side duplex. That wasn't an addition that, because right now, I don't know if you know, but there's plaques on some of the houses about from historic renovation. Basically, it says you've restored it with under the guidelines of I think that's what the plaque means. Actually, I don't actually know that. Under the guidelines of the Rivermont Historic District, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
So things like I think when they had taken this house and made it into 4 units, like upstairs, downstairs, downstairs, and then restored it to the original duplex, which I thought was I don't know, can you comment on like duplexes it doesn't seem like something that would have been built that early on, but it was.
Yes, so if I'm not mistaken, is that in the lower Rivermont area?
It's 1806.
1806, okay. So yes, so there is limitations with Rivermont being a historic district about what you can do with the houses, the alterations you can make.
Yeah.
But I don't know, maybe Dr. Shureiko can comment on that a little bit.
Of course, I can spend an hour and a half, if not 3.5 hours, talking about all these questions. The duplexes, it was interesting. These weren't just all giant single-family homes when they built this. There really was a mixed use of houses along the avenue. Yes, your house actually won an award from the Lynchburg Historical Foundation because of the restoration. As far as restorations, what you do internally, you can do a lot of things. You can do anything internally. It's just the external look of the house is what is controlled by a historic district. And if anyone wants to talk about the perceived classism of historic districts, I can certainly talk about that. Most of Lower Rivermont is about geography, not about class. That's a problematic term. It's the part of Rivermont that goes from Fifth Street up to where the gas stations are, where Bedford Avenue cuts in. That was the vast majority of those houses in the early 2000s were owned by two families who were not keeping them up whatsoever. They were the ones most resistant to the historic district. The historic district actually allows for tax breaks for people. So we've seen a movement, even on Lower Rivermont, for more individual owners in some of these houses where they can apply for tax breaks to help fix up their houses. And so rather than seeing it totally as a class-based thing, there are actually financial incentives for being part of an historic district, besides this sort of aesthetic issue of, do you want to have a house, do you want Rivermont to look like parts of Detroit?
Right.
Or for that matter, even South Bend, where they tear down houses when they become so uninhabitable, they have no choice. So, but there's much more to say about this.
Hannah, your mic is on.
Yeah. But I'll stop for now.
Yeah.
No worries.
Any other quick questions?
I have a question.
Yep.
I wanted to ask you how you thought this might apply to, let's say, more rural or lower income areas of even just Virginia. So I grew up in the middle of nowhere, Virginia, and it's kind of heartbreaking anytime I drive back to my hometown because you see these gorgeous, wonderful, beautiful buildings, and then right beside it, you'll see another one that's literally falling down, right?
Right.
And so as economics change, the town I grew up in was a big rural town, experienced a big boom, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and now it has no industry whatsoever. So as it changes, I find that we're losing a lot of this history, which makes me very sad. Mm-hmm. But I'm also wondering, how do you think something like a historic district like, Rivermont, there's a lot of class and privilege there, but what about places where you don't have that class and privileges, but you still have these kind of sort of grand historic homes?
Right, I agree. I mean, that's why historic preservation is so important. To see these buildings falling apart, it breaks my heart. I want to see as many of these buildings preserved as possible, mm-hmm. even in your hometown. That's heartbreaking to hear. But I would say there needs to be a balance. We need to effectively ensure that these homes in these lower class areas are being preserved as well, and there's not a priority set on higher class homes. So there definitely needs to be a balance there. Hope that answers your question. Okay.
I also wanted to add a note. I'm currently in Duxbury, Massachusetts, which was founded in 1637. It's one of the only oldest towns in the country. And one of the things that has happened class-wise here is that people who have a ton of money have moved in and taken what were historically tiny little summer cottages, like that mm-hmm. didn't have insulation, and they've torn them down and put up McMansions. So you're seeing that a lot in New England, that the historic stuff is actually being decimated by the people who have the money to renovate, which is kind of the opposite.
Right.
Yes.
So Dr. Warren asked a question, if we use the city assessor parcel viewer. And actually, yes, that was our primary source to access ownership histories. And yes, that's exactly where we gathered when these people own these homes, when they sold them. So it's really interesting. That's a great resource that we used. They only went back so far, of course, and then we had to use Dr. Shirako's paper records that he had gathered himself in the past. Let's see if there's any more questions here.
Those paper records were actually from the assessor's office too. That when they mm-hmm. uploaded the information, they didn't bother to go all the way back for a lot of these properties. So.
Dr. Warren had another question. Have you considered leveraging the power of social media to garner past history of Rivermont buildings? I think that would be another thing we could do in the future, just reaching out, putting out word that we're doing this project with this website, you know, gather more interviews that way. That would be very cool. Yeah, if there's, I hope I didn't miss any questions here, but if anybody else has any, I'd be glad to answer them.
Cool. Yay to everybody.
Thank you.
I mean, unless there are any broad-based questions, this, I just want to echo what Dr. Shireko said a little while ago, that these, I've been watching these presentations for 8 years now, and these are some of the best presentations I've seen. And in some ways, I think that COVID brought you guys to an even higher level of needing to be able to communicate your stuff and not rely on being able to pace back and forth or distract people with sort of, I don't know, theater productions in front of people. And you've all done an amazing job. And having watched your initial presentations to now, I would highly recommend that all of you go back and look at your initial ones and then look at the ones you did today, because you will be amazed at how well you all have done and how much improvement you've all made in your speaking ability, your organizational skills. I really have been impressed with how you guys took feedback we gave you and have just run with it. And I've been really proud to work with all of you, and your faculty mentors are amazing as well. So all of this will be available online, on the website, on our shared drive. Does anybody have any final things that they want to add or say? Please, faculty, remember to do your evaluations of, because we need those to be able to pick the prize winners. Also, students and faculty, if you will do the surveys that I sent out to you yesterday, that's a really important feedback in the horrible, awful chance that we have to do this again online. We need to know what worked and what didn't work. So any other comments or questions from anybody?
You all did so good.
Very happy that we did this online. I'm very, very pleased that we were able to do that. And I, just like Dr. Shireko said, I've heard from some of my students I teach in online classes that their school canceled their summer research, you know, so I'm glad we didn't.
Yep. Louisa, you had a comment.
Just about travel grants.
Yes, go.
We have them due usually by 5 today, but we hadn't been talking about them, so perhaps we might postpone that for a day or two if people need time. And I can send out the application to everyone so that we all know what it is.
Yeah, Katrin, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I have a question about that. So we know we have a travel ban for the next semester, and our big neuroscience conference, which is where we were going to present this, is in November or late October. And is it possible to submit a travel grant application for the neuroscience that will be in 2021? Which is, I don't really know what to do. I don't want to miss out on being able to go to, because that's really the venue that that we would want to present this at.
I'm going to defer to Peter on this because he is the, I mean, he's the head of the Center for Student Research.
I think we'd have to go to, oh, sorry, let me close my door. Sorry, I think that's an interesting question. I think we'd have to go to, I can't answer it right off because of the budget years and the way that works with the budget. I can't answer that right off, but definitely thank you for bringing it up, and we will talk about it and come to a conclusion within days.
Do you think I should just submit one anyway? Like,
yeah, well, do you, okay, so what I would say is ideal is if you had a potential alternative to submit two. Submit one for the thing that you want the most, and then submit one for an alternative that is either virtual this year or in person in the spring. That hopefully there won't be a travel ban in the spring, but we don't know that.
Right, and also just one more thing, any of you who are in the same boat with me, I don't know yet if neuroscience will be virtual. It could be that it would just be taken into a virtual realm because of all this, right?
Right.
I won't know that, so I guess maybe.
Right. Actually, here's what I would do is I would write it for this fall's neuroscience conference. And obviously there's a travel ban. So when so either we defer it for a year or it goes virtual and you can go virtual, or if we accept it and then you say, oh, we don't want to go virtual this fall, but there's something in the spring that we could do instead, we can change it. But yeah, I think it actually makes more sense just to apply for it as if it was happening this fall, and then we can decide what to do with that.
Thanks.
A quick question. How long what is the actual normal time limit for the travel? Is it December,
1 year.
1 year from now?
It's the fiscal year. It's until June 30th of 2021.
Okay.
Or till graduation, right? If someone's a senior.
Sorry, thank you. Yes, they can't travel on the college after they graduate. Thank you, Sarah.
So I think I'm going to check with Louisa and Peter after this meeting. Peter and Louisa and Aaron, if you could stay on, because I think we do have to, in my opinion, we do have to extend the deadline at least for a couple days, just because.
Oh yeah, I mean like next Friday or something.
Yeah. So if we're going to extend it at least a week, so next Friday, if everybody, and Louisa will send out information because she's our information goddess. So. Any other questions or comments? You guys were amazing. Thank you, thank you, thank you, everybody who participated this summer. I'm so glad we got to do it. I look forward to seeing the sophomores back again next summer, possibly. And for the rising seniors, I look forward to seeing all your stuff at the symposium in April, because we will be back on campus in April. So that's it, everybody. Have a great day. I'm going to